Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it is once again time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. Yep, it's time for yet another gigantic freaking roundup. Every one of these has gotten bigger than the one before it. Last time I had 25, and this time I have 30 releases on the docket. 2 not from 2020, but the rest are catch-up from throughout the year. Going through these as briefly as I see fit, and probably not briefly enough. We're inevitably ending up with well over an hour and probably over an hour and a half long video that I'm not even recording all of in the same day since last time I did this. I actually ran out of space on my camera. So, abrupt lighting changes inbound. For what it's worth, I haven't been intentionally trying to make these roundups longer. Reviewing 30 albums in one video is absolutely a mistake, and I'm gonna need to seriously cut back on how much goes into these roundups going forward, so I don't totally burn myself out multiple times. But I still went through with this because 2020 has just been an exceptionally strong year for electronic music. I've even run into some more possible year-end picks that I wouldn't have had time to cover otherwise, just here in this roundup. That's also why I wanted to make sure that I got this done before the end of the year. While I'm inevitably going to miss a bunch of other projects, this is only some stuff I missed, after all. Despite the length of the video. There's been so many projects this year that have caught my interest, and I can't possibly get to everything. But if there's any more that I missed that I end up wanting to cover in some regard, I guess there's always next time, I don't know. Oh yeah, and unrelated shameless plug, but in case you missed it, I just dropped my new album Noontide Side Attic Drifter the other day. It's out on all the usual platforms, Bandcamp, Spotify, iTunes, etc. I'm pretty proud of it. Bandcamp link is in the description. But enough of that. Let's get into it, starting once again with a project that I fulfilled a paid request on and felt like highlighting here. From Starleen, Life is Strange EP. Okay, this artist paid me on the $10 tier of my Patreon page for a text post review. Well, actually it was her producer, I believe. But whatever. I will link the full post below if you want to hear my full thoughts, but I gotta say, for a complete no-name artist, from what I can tell, I was really impressed by this. It's really well polished sounding and sounds more like some up-and-coming indie artist signed to Ninja Tune. Pretty talented singer going over some very IDM-influenced beats and making some really solid experimental pop. May not be the most unique stuff I've ever heard, kinda reminds me of, say, Emika a little. Though I think I like this a little more than what I heard of her, a tad catchier and more energetic. Now this project did also massively benefit from low expectations. If this had come from an actual up-and-comer on Ninja Tune, I would not have found this noteworthy at all. But I pretty much never see this level of polish out of no-name independent artists and their debut EPs, especially the kind that, you know, pay me on Patreon and stuff. And as someone who can appreciate how difficult it is to nail this kind of alternative pop music, especially for those with little to no budget, this is a really promising start, and I think she deserves a bigger audience. Go check her out. Can't wait to hear where she goes from here. 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Paul van Dyk, Guiding Light. Let's be real, Paul van Dyk is one of the reasons I started up the Some Stuff I Missed format in the first place. I even kind of directly mentioned this in my review of his last album, Music Rescues Me. That album, quite good for what it was, perfectly enjoyable, but there was just absolutely nothing for me to actually break down or discuss there. The kind of thing that's really more meant for this kind of format of video. The thing about Van Dyk is that at this point in his career, after decades of changing sounds and styles, he's just kind of decided to stick to his own lane of making no-nonsense trance music with no caveats and sticking firmly to his own easily recognizable style, completely ignoring current trends. And that seems to have worked out well for him. From Then On was really good and got a really enthusiastic fan response, so Music Rescues Me was just that album again, but bigger and longer and less varied, but, you know, still cool. I had every expectation that Guiding Light was once again gonna be more of that same kind of stuff. Figured I would like it, figured I knew exactly what it would sound like, but also figured it wouldn't really give me much to actually say about it. And, yeah, basically got exactly what I expected. But it was a ton of fun for what it was. I guess it's marginally more melody-centric than the last one? I don't know, I haven't listened to his other ones in a while. It's basically just from then on part 3, I guess. There was a stretch of a few tracks where the mastering felt a tad off, from Exhale to Parallel Dimension, that didn't quite hit for me as well as others, even if I quite liked the melody of the former. And much like on the last 2 projects, nearly every track has a featuring credit with another producer, yet you can't tell any of them apart from each other. They all just sound like Paul Van Dyk. But still, you just want some straightforward trance with the same epic build-ups and payoffs and triumphant melodies that you've come to expect. Paul Van Dyk delivered on that as well as he always does. I will say this project's opening stretch of 3 tracks was probably the best part of it, getting a more down-tempo leaning cut in Deep Within, leading into a Sue McLaren featuring vocal track in the title track, and then one of the best-sounding regular trance cuts in the bunch with You Found Me, and from there it just mostly follows the same old formulas with no twists. I did like the marginally darker grooves of Remedy and Resource. The latters made me fucking transcend. That was awesome. Duality also sounded pretty dang great, and the way Galaxy progressed and the sounds that went into it were actually surprisingly interesting and kept me guessing at where it was gonna go next. And Velvet Sky was a satisfyingly spacious finish as well. That one also kicked ass. But yeah, that's about all I got. It's a Paul Van Dyk album. He's got nothing to prove anymore, and there's not a single surprise to be found here. You should probably know what you're getting into. But I still absolutely enjoyed myself the whole way through. You can still, like, melt your face off without trying, and the best moments are just on another level. I may only properly love about half of this album, and it could have been solidly in the 8 range with some cutting down, but it's just a lot of really solid trance music as usual, and achieved everything it set out to do. So I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. It was good. Next up, Erasure, The Neon. What a sight to sore eyes. Alright, Erasure's still doing their thing. I did cover their last main album, World Be Gone, in 2017 if you want some more thoughts on their other stuff. Hoped I'd be into this new one. I don't think Erasure has an album I've truly disliked, even if they're hardly consistent and have quite a few meh ones. Wasn't expecting anything on the level of Violet Flame, but had my fingers crossed for some solid synth pop. And I guess that's basically what I got. It's just a standard Erasure album without any special twists. Lyrics are fine, instrumentals are what you would expect, melodies are pretty catchy, Andy Bell is as enjoyable a singer as he always is and sounds like he's having fun as you'd hope for. It's a fun listen, and I really don't have much of anything to actually say about it. I guess I did often find the percussion on these tracks to be a little on the weak side and could have stood to be punchier, though that might have just been because I listened to it right after a Paul Van Dyk album. There's a neat piano ballad in New Horizons that I'm fairly certain uses the same MIDI piano patch that I use in my own music. I like the lead hooks on Hey Now Think I Got a Feeling, can pretty easily get stuck in my head. Nerves of Steel and Diamond Lies have really solid core melodies and hooks too. The latter's probably my favorite track in the bunch. And the last 2 tracks are disappointingly meh and make for a pretty underwhelming finish to this project. And I don't have anything else to add. There's really not much notable about this project or anything to break down here. I did get the baseline level of enjoyment I would want out of an Erasure album, and that baseline enjoyment was probably higher than World Be Gone, though that album also had much better and more interesting lyrics. I could more respect what they were doing on that one. This one just kind of feels like they're going through the motions. In their decades-long career of putting out solid synth pop, this really isn't a noteworthy entry into their catalog. It's just kind of there. But, I don't know, it's still probably worth a shot if you're a fan. It has its moments and doesn't do anything objectionable, so I guess take that all as you will. 6.5 out of 10. Next up, from the Gaslamp Killer, Heart Math. Alright, I semi-recently covered the Gaslamp Killer in a Patreon request video earlier this year, reviewed his second album, Instrumental Apathy, and thought it was pretty good. Nice little slice of instrumental hip-hop with a very overtly psychedelic edge. Haven't remotely had the urge to listen to it again since posting that video. The whole thing had this like weirdly unpleasant and sinister vibe to it that kind of turned me off in a way that I couldn't put my finger on. But I figured that was just part of the whole point and left it at that. But when I saw he had another album out this year, I plopped it into this video out of curiosity. And this latest album, for the most part, sounds like a retread of his last one. Albeit this time there's more tracks, less time for these ideas to develop. And it's a lot less consistent as well. It still has more texture and development than what I remember of his debut, but yeah, was kind of left cold by this one, honestly. It kind of felt like the same album again, but all my problems with it were a lot more pronounced and harder to overlook. Not to say it didn't still have its moments. Both of the tracks with Miguel Atwood Ferguson were excellent, tons of texture, and the string sections brought a sense of mystical and uplifting brightness to these otherwise dark mixes of oily synths and breaks. They were great, wish we got more stuff like that. I quite liked the more expansive and atmospheric sound design of Blue Butterfly and To Fathom Hell or To Soar Angelic. Also liked the way those two tracks directly segued into each other. And the synth workouts and bass lines on Midnight Music were quite nice as well. All these tracks were solid. But there were also tracks like Malcolm's Library, which started out pretty compelling with this kind of funky upright bass line and drum break, but got totally ruined by these overbearing creepy synth melodies that did not fit over them at all. And weird spoken word stuff near the end just felt like a mess. Or Blind Dog, which had all these blaring horn solos that I really wanted to like, but they just kinda got grating in many parts. Also had that whole Tecton outro that felt kind of pointless. And there were a bunch of tracks that were nothing more than, like, kinda hollow psychedelic meanderings, especially in the first half of this thing. See the unpleasant synth doodles of Null and Void, the dull clavinet workouts on One Take Jake, or the disappointing Heliocentrics collab hooked on classics that did have quite a bit of texture, but just kind of felt like a bunch of musicians doing things completely disconnected from each other and just didn't come together or convey any real emotion. Oh, and let's not forget Moving On, which I think might have GLK's own vocals on it, and he sounds like a freaking homeless person. Just cannot sing at all and sounds like total crap. And that track also has a long, rambly, pointless outro as well. This project is just a total freaking mixed bag, and often kind of a tough one to get through. Now, I don't know if I feel like completely writing off this project as something you should skip. The Gaslamp Killer is definitely an artist who's established his own unique identity, and even in this project's worst moments, nobody else sounds like him. And the best moments on here did still make it at least partially worth the trouble, if only every track on here was on the same level as something like God Willing. But moments like these feel like the exception and not the norm, and I feel like a lot of these experiments went over in a better and a more engaging way on his last album. While I can respect what he's doing here and appreciate that he's continuing to carve out his own lane in electronic music, this just was not that fun to listen to, and I do not see myself coming back to it. Overall feeling a 5.7 out of 10. Next up, from rival consoles, Articulation. Okay, so I recently did a proper review of this guy's fourth album, Howl, as per a direct Patreon request, having never heard any of his other work. In that video's comments, there was quite a bit of discussion on this guy's previous back catalog and people recommending me different albums from the guy besides that one. And the requester himself, who seemed quite disappointed that I didn't pick up on the album's modern classical influences, which really resonated with him. And I did actually notice after he pointed it out and enjoy the album closer more for it, but it probably says something that I didn't notice it on my own. Whatever the case, I wanted to catch myself up on this guy's other albums, and figuring I wasn't going to have much to say in a proper video on him, I just threw him in here instead. But here's a quick rundown of what I thought of his previous albums leading up to this one. Ooh, I really like this one. Just straightforward techno beats and abrasive electro synths with some extra acid touches, super hard-hitting stuff, tons of bangers. Kinda makes the rival console's name feel more fitting. I can hang on to this. Like the last album, but with more obvious modern classical influences in the chord progressions and melodies, almost kinda Justice-ish. I got where that requester was coming from a lot more easily after hearing this contrast directly now. Much more minimal and stripped back sound here, also much less interesting, unfortunately. The closer with Peter Broderick was fine, but it was kind of too little too late. Probably skippable. My thoughts haven't fundamentally changed on this one since reviewing it. It's nice, but kinda inconsistent. Having now heard it in fuller context, I can see how someone thought it could be a good introductory point. It has some decent variety at least, but aside from a few choice moments, I don't think I'd rank it among his best personally. Like the last two albums, and that's it. Kind of boring, honestly. This was the one most people told me was his best, and yeah, it might be. It sounds a lot like something Clark would do, especially that guy's self-titled. But it's got the hard-hitting grooves and instrumental texture to back it up, and still fits his unique style anyway, so I'll take it. This was solid. Which brings us to here. This guy can be pretty hit and miss, admittedly. He's got some keepers in his catalog and some total snoozers. It was a coin toss on whether I'd be into this newest project, which came out this past July. Didn't have soaring expectations for it, given it was only 6 tracks in 33 minutes, and the other 2 6-track albums I heard from him were also my least favorite ones of his. But after listening to this one, actually turns out this is really solid. Not gonna say this is anything mind-blowing. From a textural standpoint, it's nothing all that special. Mostly just very straightforward John Hopkins adjacent house music as you'd expect out of him. But like his Kid Velo album, this was one of those projects where the chord progressions and melodies did a lot of the heavy lifting. They feel like they have more depth and complexity than your average house musician, and the modern classical influences showing in a fairly obvious way. And these tracks have some better defined structure to them, like they always know where they're going. It has way more focus than Howl did as well. I feel like this is the experience that the requester thought I was gonna get when he gave me Howl. Like, that album was cool, but what I got out of this feels like it was a much closer match to how he described his experience of that one. It's still not a project I actually have much to say about. 6 tracks, 33 minutes, hence how it ended up here. But it was really nice. Like, surprisingly got some emotional resonance out of me that a lot of his projects weren't able to pull off as effectively. Tracks like Vibrations on a String and Sudden Awareness of Now would go on for a fairly long time, but have these fairly epic sounding chord progressions. That opener's probably my favorite track in the bunch. It just sounded so freaking good and pulled me in so well. Reminds me of stuff like John Hopkins' Everything Connected. And that closer was definitely a satisfying and heartwarming, but still driving and fittingly climactic way to go out. And those other tracks like Forwardism and the title track, which maybe didn't hook me in as strongly, but they were still really nice. Really like the way how the former directly segued out of the opener, and the chilling woodwind-like synth pads that were featured around the parts of this thing, going up against those Immunity-style bouncing beats. And the title track hits a lot of the same notes for me as the opener, but this is probably the track with the most progression to it, and the widest variety of synth timbres, and it all comes together stunningly well. There's even 2 ambient-leaning cuts. Of the 2, I definitely prefer Melodica. Just very simple and stripped-back Rhodes pianos and plucking guitars over ambient pads, and has all these relaxing sounds of what sounds like ice cracking and melting or something. Creates this really nice and comfy meditative subspace. I love it. And still here, well, the kind of more trained C synth plucks of that one weren't as effective at their atmosphere building, but still got some emotion to carry across. Yeah, I did not go into this expecting it to be anything special, but this was way better than I thought it would be. It's definitely one of my favorite projects this guy's put out to date, if not just my favorite, period. I feel like I'm at the same point I was when I covered that Mew Juice album, where it's like on the verge of greatness. And that one stuck to me to the point of being a possible year-end list contender. And honestly, this one might even be a little bit better than that one was. I'm not sure, it's really close. There is definitely something special here, really well executed in its relative simplicity, and I'd kept wanting to come back to it while working on this entire roundup and listening to it while taking breaks in between segments, which is a really good sign that this could be a more long-term keeper. We'll see how things go, but I'm enjoying it more and more with every listen. It's definitely one of my big personal highlights of this roundup. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on this. Next up, AU5, Alchemy. Alright, I covered AU5 in the first volume of Some Stuff I Missed with his Divinorum album. Thought that project was pretty solid, if not always as mind-blowing as some people made it out to be. But this past August, he put out this album, which seemed to put all its focus on the more down-tempo and ambient side of his sound, which, given the more ambient-centric parts of his last album were among my favorite parts of it, I decided to give this a shot. And yeah, this was pretty nice. Still wasn't so blown away by it to say that I loved it, but I definitely enjoyed myself. I did probably enjoy Divinorum more, which is interesting because I think this album did address my biggest criticisms with that album. I thought that project was kind of derivative 2013 era EDM and modern dubstep electro house styles. This one being so much more ambient centric does not have that issue. It sounds a lot less attached to a specific time in electronic music history, and like AU5 is doing more of his own thing within this specific genre. That said, Divinorum also felt a lot more ambitious and had a lot more sonic variety. This one's a little on the samey side. Wasn't nearly as interesting a listen. Now, this project definitely had a strong start. The sparkling and shuffling beats of the title track created a really immersive nocturnal atmosphere that pulled me in right away, almost a little John Hopkins-ish, and it had some sidetracks into some fairly impressive sounding ambient pads. It was great. Vapor and Mist kept up a similar atmosphere with some slower moving beats, but no less well textured or immersive, especially really like the flute riffs on the latter. And at this point I was really on board for this, though unfortunately the next stretch of 3 tracks wasn't quite as strong. Neptuna did build up some really intriguing atmosphere with its subtle bleeping arpeggios, ringing synth bells, and splashing water effects, but didn't really justify going on for 7 minutes, just kind of stuck to the same mix of sounds through its entire running time, didn't really feel like it went anywhere. Etheros was a nice beatless cut, could have fit on something like BT's Between Here and You. But again, I kinda lost interest in its mix of angelic ambient pads over the course of almost 7 minutes. The cliff did thankfully have some more progression and to better justify it breaking 8 minutes. There was a little segment that had some plucking trance synths. The whole thing shifted into a stranger and marginally darker sounding mix in its second half. It was nice, though I feel like this one would have been much more impactful if it didn't come right after a very similar sounding beatless cut that wasn't as well executed. And thankfully the final track, Return to Moonland, is also a major return to form for the album, a mostly orchestral piece that had a lot of dynamic range and emotion poured into it. Got pretty damn epic and intense in parts as well. Really climactic and impactful finish to this thing. And yeah, as a whole, this album was definitely solid. Did have a stretch of tracks that could get a little long-winded and dull, but there were more good moments than bad ones, and the weaker moments here were still fine. I'm probably not going to be hanging on to this one long-term, but it's definitely worth giving a shot. A lot of cool stuff to be found here. Overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this one. Next up, from Bent, Up in the Air. Oh man, Bent, it's great to see these guys back after so many years. I'd actually thought about doing a proper video on this one since Bent's first album, Programmed to Love from 2000, is still to this day one of my favorites of all time, having absolutely loved their whimsical blend of laid-back down-tempo that would sometimes create the most gorgeous, pillowy atmosphere you've ever heard, and other times would be goofy and silly, but got all of it to work so well together and never had a dull moment. I could gush about that first album and ramble about its confusing alternate versions for different countries for ages. I'll have to do a proper video on it for someday. Though perhaps unfortunately, as much as they tried, they were never able to follow it up with something on that level again. The other albums are all pretty good, though. Decent at their absolute worst and all having their standout moments. Everlasting Blink in 2003 did effectively recapture that same playful and pillowy atmosphere that debut had several standouts that could in fact hit that same level of quality, like Beautiful Otherness, Magic Love, or Exercise 3, if not nearly as consistent or memorable as a whole. Aerials in 2004 was markedly better and much more consistent, went for a more serious vocal-centric approach with much less reliance on samples, could really hit emotionally hard if not retaining the same unique and easily recognizable style I'd associate with them. The first 4 tracks probably hitting the hardest. And then Intercept in 2006 went back to their old goofy sample-based style and even some weird classic rock influences, which were interesting. And while it was more consistent than Everlasting Blink, it didn't have standouts as memorable. But after that album, they went inactive, with this new one being their comeback after a 14-year hiatus, also only being 8 tracks running at just under 40 minutes. The kind of thing that ultimately would be better fit for this kind of format instead of its own proper video, not likely the kind of stuff that would give me much to break down or discuss. Oh well, hopefully we still got some solid stuff out of this new project, so how does Up in the Air fare? It's pretty much exactly what you would expect. Same kinds of super airy and ethereal poppy down-tempo that they've stuck to since the beginning, ridiculously light and inoffensive stuff. And given that scant length, there's not really a lot of room for this to leave much of an impact. But as usual, it's still definitely at its moments, and they did attempt to give this project a bit more of an identity to set itself apart from their other ones. What with the cow on the cover, they do try to capture that kind of rural aesthetic as best as they can, occasionally moving their sound into a marginally folksier direction, most obviously on the intro Take 15 with all its melancholy steel guitars going over the usual airy synth pads, and penultimate track, Remove All Clocks, which, while I'm on the topic of that track, I may as well say that the last 2 tracks on this album were the best ones by a long shot. Remove All Clocks itself sounds like a cut from Bibio's Ribbons in the best way. Super warm mix of acoustic guitars, pianos, and even vibraphones. Really fuzzy and nostalgic stuff that totally caught me off guard and how well it came together. That one was great. And then the album's closer, Friends, seems to be the one they're pushing as a single, and yeah, it's the best track on here without question. A sudden switch into all these fast-paced disco beats and string licks with really freaking deep bass lines and piano progressions. The groove is legit on par with Maybe Always from the debut. And then there's some uncredited melancholy guest singer that comes in later. It was just so freaking good. And you know what, I'll also mark Eagle and Swan as a highlight. Created this really freaking nice nocturnal jazzy soundtrack vibe with the flute solos to boot. That one was really damn good too. But as for other moments, none of them were bad, none of them were great. Come On Home and When You Come By were nice and pleasant sample-driven tracks that had their usual old schmaltzy 70s AM radio singers on them, like a Ribbon for My Hair. And the former had a low-key sax solo on it, which I liked, but felt kinda out of place. And there were 2 tracks where one or both of the guys from the band handled vocals themselves in A Girl Like You and Misty, and yeah, singing was not great. though both of these tracks are musically fine. The former has some pretty emotionally resonant piano chord progressions going under them and even some orchestral touches, and the latter sounds like an electronic rework of a track that could have played on like an oldies radio station when I was a kid. But that's pretty much all there is to this album. Certainly no outright duds here and a tangible vibe that it created with everything else, and those last two tracks totally knocked it out of the park. I guess I would technically have to mark this album as my least favorite of theirs on lack of substance or ambition alone, not that I have a lot of picks to choose from. But I do also kind of like the cohesiveness of this one, and as usual there were definitely parts of it that resonated strongly with me. Absolutely nothing life-changing here, and I have no expectation this is going to stick with me long-term, but I guess I'm glad for the reminder that these guys exist and for the moments on here that did work for me. So I'll give it a very strong 6.7 out of 10. Next up, from Russolo Collective, Tapes, Selection 1. Okay, so there's this little label on Bandcamp called Speak and Spell Records. They're home to Veilsmith's Are You Sick of Being Unlucky and Shy's Obscura, among others. Both of those projects were really good and have had some staying power with me in 2020, and more recently I've been browsing this label and seeing what else they've had to offer. They'd really start to make me feel like I should be paying more attention to them. They've got a fairly solid roster, as far as I can tell. So I'm going to cover 3 projects from this label in a row here, starting out with an album from the label's founder. Russolo Collective, aka Josh. He's an abstract IDM artist, and this was his first proper album, or mixtape rather. He did have an EP last year that I remember making some minor waves in these small-time YouTube critic circles called You on the Bed, Me in the Sink, which is a great title for a project, though I let it pass me by at the time, I guess, since it was only 4 tracks or something. I did enjoy that project, coming back to it later, by the way. Nice low-key abstract stuff with some pretty creative and dense glitchy sound design. But this was a little meatier track length-wise, so I decided to highlight it here and give it a shot, and yeah, this was really solid stuff as well. This appears to mostly be a sample collage project, and the sample sources could be anything from old recordings of singers, to sound effects of clinking glasses and splashing water and silverware, to police radio conversations, to field recordings and whatever else applicable, presumably also actual synth melodies and MIDI pianos and that kind of stuff as well. And the final effect does come pretty close to the kind of wonky beat work that Veilsmith does. A bit more stripped back and low-key, but with a similar mix of chill atmosphere and strange IDM abstraction. And I definitely had fun with it. Maybe all the water sound effects could make me want to go to the bathroom, but yeah, this was some really nice creative stuff. Now, the 11 tracks on this thing only add up to about 25 minutes total, and this project also feels like the kind of thing where it's trying more to make all these tracks come together as one holistic experience than get every moment to be super impactful in its own right. There are definitely higher and lower points, but none of them feel outright skippable. Among my favorites were the shuffling beats, maybe Kalimba's pitch-down singing sample and fuzzy off-key pads of the opener, If You Like It, the bright and fast-paced progressions of 2001, occasionally hard-cutting into low-key melancholy pianos, and back. That was probably my favorite cut here. And I liked how the following interlude, A Quick Reminder, seemed to directly segue out of it as part of the same track. The water bottle and silverware noises going over muted electric piano chords and a repetitive sample talking about a dangerous woman on Dangerous. That was pretty neat. I also really liked the blue-green and the sort of vaporwavy quality to the drum break on that one, and how it surprisingly had some nice energy behind it despite the chill pads and muted sub-bass. The history of jazz could stick out to me with its melancholy synth horns going over the usual mix of sampled sound effect percussion, creating a fairly warm and striking atmosphere. Let That Radicalize You had police radios going over banging IDM beats and low-key and emotive electric piano progressions, another one of my favorites. And the closer, Permanent Waitlist, had a bunch of different sections ranging from airy ambience with unintelligible reverb-soaked vocal effects in the background, clanging wind chime bells, and laid their whole surprisingly fast-paced drum break-driven second half. Whole track kind of reminded me of Seced's Trishesla, I guess. Another solid highlight there. Though not every track was a winner for me. I thought the pitch-down vocal samples on Rubber Band were a little annoying, and the submarine clanking beats not among the most notable in the greater mix of the album. The trap beats underscoring Nowhere felt a bit generic to me, even if the various percussive clanging samples that ran through that track were able to give it some identity. Also, ironically, the track Don't Trust the Police turned out to be among the least memorable moments on here, despite the politically relevant title. It was just kind of a semi-pretty mix of field recordings and lumbering microhouse percussion falling over itself that just didn't really stick out much in the greater mix of the album. But still, if a moment like that is the lowest point here, that's probably a good sign. And yeah, this was all around a pretty solid effort. I don't think this is necessarily going to be sticking with me long term, but I can definitely get behind the creativity and well-textured sound design, and how well executed the overall vibe of everything was. There's the potential for something really special out of this guy, even if I'm not quite sure we're all the way there yet. Still definitely worth giving a shot if you haven't already. I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Haunted Disco, Gnossienne. Okay, round 2 from Speak and Spell Records. Here's someone I've technically covered before. The artist in question, real name Madeline Lentz, a while back sent me her dark ambient sample collage album Pale Souls Glow in the Dark to check out as a Patreon request, and I was pleasantly surprised with it. Ended up highlighting it at the very beginning of the previous volume of some stuff I missed. Still think that project is worth checking out if you haven't already. Since then, I've browsed through some of her other stuff she's put out over the years, and I will say that project I was sent wasn't entirely indicative of her overall sound and style, which is a lot more varied and has been going on a lot longer than I would have thought. She's been at it since 2013, and her stuff does often include those kinds of sound collage and ambient styles, but also just as often touches into indie pop and instrumental hip-hop. Sometimes she focuses on samples, sometimes she even includes her own vocals. She's actually pretty versatile. So when this project got announced, I decided to add it to this lineup and see how it stacked up. Now, this is a very different album from Pale Souls, much more of a low-key indie pop songwriter trip-hop type project. Lo-fi bedroom pop that's actually lo-fi. It's a very personal album with actual vocals that are super heavily filtered and sound like they're singing to you through multiple brick walls or through an old pre-YouTube internet video whose only streaming quality is potato. But it also has a lot of the same dark ambient styles of other projects I heard from her too, an extremely moody and downbeat release as you might expect. Now, this was a project that required several listens for me to be able to pin down how I felt. Wasn't super keen on it at first, and was kind of put off by the more upbeat and happier sounding tracks, not feeling like they fit next to the darker and creepier ones. Also was even more put off by the non-transitions between tracks. Every single track ends in a super abrupt, out-of-nowhere hard cut. It was really jarring. That said, the music itself was definitely a grower with repeat listens. I did quite like the vocals right from the jump, even if they are ridiculously filtered to the point where you can't understand a single word she's saying. Her performances are fittingly tired and world-weary to fit the tone of the album. They kind of remind me of that one time Norkin tried to include female vocals on his track Here from Our Memories of Winter. It just kind of came down to individual tracks, which could be a bit hit and miss. The lower key ballad type tracks tend to be among my favorites on here, especially the mysterious tinges on Shadows, the near total dark ambient airiness of Overture to a Looming Monolith, and a twinkling and melancholy lullaby, Waitin' on a Star. The latter was probably my favorite cut on here, and the emotional high point, even if all those vocal harmonies at the end could sound a tad ridiculous. And I liked pretty much all the interludes as well, be it the Tim Hecker-esque intro, the first chord, the moody solo performance on All the Lost Souls Beneath the Towering Obelisks, the twinkling bells on Road Ahead as well, all nice additions, and I can't mark any of them as least favorites. The happier tracks I mentioned before were definitely an acquired taste. I Can't Sleep probably being the track that took the longest to warm up to, and still not a favorite. Instrumentally felt kind of cliched as far as bedroom pop goes, and the very tired tone of the vocals sort of clashed with instrumental, though the latter issue became less bothersome the more I listened to it. Sunday I mainly just didn't like the beginning when Madeline is struggling to hit some high notes over a saccharine kalimba-centric beat, and she doesn't sound that great. Also, the way the lyrics in that part are capitalized on the Bandcamp page is not helping, but the way that track progresses from there ended up working really well, especially that part where the banjos and strings come in at the end was a really nice moment. Also didn't mind the cloudy and more nostalgic mood of Conway, kinda gave me Bent vibes, minus any sonic clarity on any of the instruments or performances. But the one happier cut that worked with me immediately and remained that way on all listens was Bask All Ye Sinners for the Light Pours From Above. That one had some more depth and complexity and texture to its indie pop arrangements. Think I might have heard some vibraphone-like sounds in the background of that one. That was a definite highlight. And then there was the ending, No Anxiety, which I don't think I would mark as one of my favorites. It ran on a bit long at 7 minutes, and the deeper voiced vocal performances sounded half asleep and somewhat inebriated. Also, everything kind of devolves into a creepy noise piece by the end. Though this track also feels like a satisfying and fitting finish to this album, the logical emotional endpoint to where all these disparate moments were leading up to, and probably the single most raw and real moment on the project. It's a solid closer even if I definitely gotta be in the right mood for it. Yeah, this album is a little all over the place, and I still don't think it comes together as a complete whole very well. It's very disjointed and scattershot. But it is generally pretty likable, has a lot of emotion put into it. I did grow to enjoy each of these tracks with enough repeat listens. I did definitely enjoy Pale Soul's Glow in the Dark more than this, and would give that a higher recommendation, but this also captured its own separate appeal. This project was better as like a personal character portrait of like this average suburban trans girl who's had a lot of ongoing struggles with mental illness, and the somewhat more relatable setting and suburbanish feeling to everything just kind of highlights how anyone could end up slipping into this fucked up state of mind. I would not call it a particularly fun listen, but I also don't think it was ever trying to be that. I guess if you're looking for some low-key bedroom pop, trip-hop type stuff with all those obvious creepy dark ambient influences, it's definitely worth giving a shot. She certainly has a unique style that she can call her own and I could recognize from a distance. This was easily the most conflicted I am on any project in this roundup. It could be a bit of a difficult listen and I don't really have the urge to come back to it. But I could appreciate everything being done here and felt like every musical choice had a clear intention and direction behind it. So I guess I'll be generous and just barely let this slide with a solid 7 out of 10. It's good, worth giving a shot. Next up from Paintscratcher, Life and Death. And now round 3 from Speak and Spell Records. Paintscratcher is the alias for ambient noise artist Robert White. This is his second project on the label. His first one was a mostly straightforward noise project with some industrial techno elements called I Don't Feel Lucky, No. I only briefly sampled through that project, seemed to be mildly interesting. If you're into that particular kind of stuff, it'll probably do you well, though I've obviously never been much of a straight noise guy myself. Still, this project caught my interest since it was marked as a love letter to the likes of Tim Hecker and Steve Reich, among others. The kind of stuff I'd probably more easily be able to get into. So I plopped it on here out of curiosity, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's a 2-track ambient project, and as you'd guess, the 2 tracks stretch on quite long. The first side, Life, goes on for 36 minutes, and the second side, Death, goes on 28 minutes. And they are, of course, fairly slow-moving, though they're hardly completely monolithic pieces, which don't fundamentally change over their lengthy running times. There's actually quite a bit of progression and sonic development in both of these pieces. Life is obviously the more positive-sounding and uplifting of the two, starting out as this beautifully building set of chimes and xylophones and bells, eventually building up into those thick, noisy, very Tim Hecker-inspired pads. There is this one, 2-minute diversion into these other muted glitching pads around the 15-minute mark, which are super, mid-treble heavy and made unpleasantly harsh and claustrophobic just through the particular way they're mixed. Was not a fan of that particular segment, but those sounds are eventually integrated in the rest of the mix quite well later on, and all of these elements slowly evolve and take varying degrees of focus over time. It's very nice. But as good as the Life segment is, I might have liked the Death segment even more, starting out as this very slow, minimal, and sparse piano plinking, with fuzzy tape artifacts building up underneath it. Then eventually the piano pieces getting much denser and more complex sounding, and as the piece goes on, the whole mix just gets enveloped in distorted noise to almost cataclysmic effect. When everything ends in distorted, high-pitched ringing, it really feels like a fittingly climactic finish, even if it hurts my ears. While this is very much the kind of project I would need to be in a specific mood to most effectively get into, and its harshest sections, especially in the Life segment, can still be a bit of a turnoff, I was surprised by how invested I was in the listening experience of this one, even in those most heavily distorted and openly harsh sections. Every sonic element of this project feels very intentional and well-crafted. This is inevitably going to get overlooked by lots of people, and I thought it was pretty damn impressive for someone with this little history or backing. So if you think you can handle the more intense sections, I think it's absolutely worth a purchase for any ambient or noise fans. And even as someone who doesn't have much patience for noise music, I still enjoyed myself pretty much all the way through, which I have to say is no small feat. Very solid stuff here, definite recommendation if you think you'd be into it. Overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. Next up, from Opus 84, VOOM EP. Alright, Opus 84, don't think I need to bother introducing her. I've covered her stuff many times over the years. Earlier this year, she put out her last album, Rotzeg, which I thought was pretty enjoyable and covered in the last Some Stuff I Missed volume. though it wasn't among her most memorable projects overall, not a keeper long term. And since then, she put out this 8-track EP supposedly influenced by French house, lo-fi hip-hop, and micro house. Recommended it to me, so I threw it in this lineup. And I will admit that when I saw French house in the genre text, I was expecting something more up-tempo and energetic than this, and got kind of thrown off on first listen. I don't know why I tuned out the other two markers. This is a pretty interesting turn for Opus specifically. Don't think I've ever heard a project like this from her before. And it's all pretty enjoyable for what it is, if nothing especially mind-blowing or anything I haven't heard before. Definitely the highest point on here was the opener, Dead VOOM, had the most energetic, punchy beat behind it, and the way it went up against those jazzy electric pianos and bass lines, then that kind of weird yelpy vocal sample was all very fun and even pretty catchy. Also thought the poppy flashiness of the closer, Limoncello, mirrored the opener quite well. That one was a highlight. Also liked the way all those sparkling melodies cascaded over each other on high delay. That track is very easily recognizable as Opus's style. And R.I.P. the Mpemba Effect has a pretty solid and bright groove to it as well, with its plinky melodic textures and glitched up vocal snippets. Sort of reminded me of the stuff she did on her old Future in the Stars album way back when. The good parts of it, at least. Even the various rising bubbly cascades of electric piano notes on the interlude Extabella made for a pretty cool effect, and I couldn't mark it as the least favorite. As for possible least favorites, I guess I wasn't crazy about Tepidori, very muted micro house-ish stuff that was nice while it was on, but didn't really stick out to me in the greater context of the track listing. And neither did the longest track, Kit Kat Grind. Again, it had plenty of nice melodies going around, but didn't really do much that stuck out to me that other tracks on here didn't already do in a more memorable way. But I mean, those two tracks really aren't that far quality-wise from the highest points on here. It is a very consistent release that didn't have any outright duds. Really, this project's biggest crime is just not being that memorable in general. While I do like every track on here, none of these stuck out to me as especially great or the best stuff I've ever heard from her. Save for maybe the opener, which was, again, the easy highlight. But everything mostly just washed over me, and I don't feel that strong an urge to come back to it. Still, as far as this kind of bright and colorful blend of micro house goes, it's all perfectly fine for what it is. It's a nice, interesting experiment for Opus that mostly went over well and is worth giving a shot if you're curious. Another very strong 6.7 out of 10, I guess. Next up, from Eric Hilton, The Impossible Silence. Eric Hilton is one half of the band Thievery Corporation. I reviewed their last main album, The Temple of I, when that came out back in 2017. If you want some more in-depth thoughts I have on them, you can check that video out. I wouldn't really consider them among my biggest favorites when it comes to down-tempo outfits, despite their pretty massive cult following. They do have quite a few solid albums I still enjoy, like Mirror Conspiracy and Radio Retaliation, among others, but they also have some duds in their catalog, like Richest Man in Babylon. And just in general, they have a pretty heavy tendency to base their arrangements on cliched stereotypes of world music from Jamaica or India or South America or wherever else applicable, and that would get kind of tiring. Probably would not have thought to check out a solo album from one half of that project, but it had been recommended to me at one point since someone thought this project sounded like Air, a downtempo outfit who I obviously hold in much higher regard. So also, I saw it randomly topping the iTunes electronic charts at one point, so I thought, what the heck, I'll throw this in here, give it a shot. Wasn't going in with particularly high expectations, but hopefully I'd get some nice chill-out material with this. And it was surprisingly pretty fun. Their comparison is 100% merited. Obviously not as good as the guys themselves, but clearly trying to convey a similar mix of sounds. The progressions of Rhodes pianos, occasional orchestral tinges, and especially those bass lines are very reminiscent of them. Kind of Premier Symptomes-ish, but with much cleaner production. Maybe kind of more like some more recent Nightmares on Wax as well. Now, this is not an album that gives me much of anything to break down, obviously, since it's here. With down-tempo mixes as simplistic and samey as these, you do walk a very fine line between being evocative and engaging and being very drab and nondescript. And Hilton walks between these two quite often, despite all these tracks sounding very similar to each other. And maybe it's a little telling that the more any given track reminded me of Air, the more I was into it. Even if some tracks on here like Alma de Lisboa or Trust the Thief or The Stranger nailed their sound well enough that I could get into it wholeheartedly and had the more textured arrangements to back it up, Especially love the Desert Tones latter one. But fact remains is that Hilton is definitely riding on their coattails for the vast majority of this album. There were a few tracks that did sound more like Thievery Corporation runoffs, sometimes not in a good way, seen as Cassette d'Afrique or Midnight in Montmartre, or however you say that, which kind of got too repetitive and ran their mixes into the ground. But sometimes you get a track that would work surprisingly well, like Acetone Dub, with its sparse pianos going over the Orbs Towers of Dub beat, and working quite effectively. Or Maestro del Suono, which had some thicker and more textured arrangements with some very nice horn lines, had more life and energy to it than much of this thing. Oh yeah, and there's a vocal track at the end called La Nuit that wouldn't have been out of place on the Saudade album. That was pretty cool. I mean, on the whole, Eric Hilton is not air, and this project is definitely a mixed bag that can run together with only specific moments really resonating strongly with me. But I'll also freely admit that I did get a lot more personal enjoyment out of this project than I went in expecting to. It scratched more of my itch for new air material than even that last Nicolas Godin project from this past January. So even though I have no plans to hang on to this long term, I am overall glad that I did spend time with it. If it were a main Thievery Corporation album, it definitely would not be in the lower tier of their catalog, so take that all as you will. This is also just barely skating by with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up, from Kelly Lee Owens, Inner Song. This is a project I actually first heard about when I saw Mark from Spectrum Pulse talking on Twitter about how he was underwhelmed by it. But the way he described it at the time still had me like, this still sounds like something I might enjoy. And then Ryan from Not Real Music gave it a pretty glowing review as well, so yeah, plopped it in here. So Kelly Lee Owens is a micro house synth pop artist from the UK. She's worked with John Hopkins and Daniel Avery, contributed some vocals to the latter's debut album, which has grown on me since I covered it in the last Some Stuff I Missed. I made sure to check out her self-titled debut from 2017 first before jumping into this, and yeah, it was pretty enjoyable. Her very airy vocals, going up against mostly very sparse house arrangements, did make for some very minimalistic grooves that still mostly ended up pretty alluring and engaging. I don't think I loved that album, could be a bit plain sounding in parts and not the most memorable stuff I've ever heard, but I did enjoy it. Especially really got in the tracks Lucid and Throwing Lines. And kinda had similar thoughts on this follow-up project as well. Wasn't mind blown by it or think it's one of my new favorites of the year or anything, but definitely enjoyed it for what it was. The thing about this project is that some cuts definitely hit for me way more than others. It's very much a mixed bag. Half of this album is ethereal, vocal-driven cuts that have lots of lush, laid-back, melodic atmosphere, and the other half is more straightforward tech house type material. I tend to be more of a fan of the vocal cuts. You look at something like On and its progression from the airy and expansive synth-pop tune into the more microhouse-driven arrangements it ends up with later on, definite favorite there. Or the reverse of that progression on Night, which isn't as strong a favorite, but still very nice. And even some of the simpler tracks in this mold could leave an impact on me, like Line. Love the tune behind that one. And the closer, Wake Up, is a super climactic and expansive finish that works really well. Oh, and Rewild, that one's cool too, if not as big a favorite as those other two. As for the tech house cuts, those were a little more hit and miss. On one hand, you got stuff like the Radiohead cover that starts everything off, which is unfortunately totally nondescript and rudimentary and kind of uninspired. Not a particularly impactful opener. Also was expecting more out of Melt. A lot of people call this one of their favorites, but I mean, while its various whispered vocal interjections and washes of tom drums cascading up and down makes for a somewhat interesting mix, the track just didn't stick with me as all that interesting. Bit too sparse and simplistic, and not an interesting enough idea to fully keep it afloat for me. But on the other hand, you got cuts like Jeanette, which may mostly be the same melodies repeating over and over and building up and down, but I never at any point got sick of those melodies and thought they were among the best this project had to offer. Or Flow, I saw that as the least favorite pick for more than one person, and I'm not really sure why. I personally really liked the muted and mysterious tones of those melodies, and the way they progressed and evolved over time. That certainly kept my attention. And also that track with John Cale, Corner of My Sky, that was another big highlight for me. The sparse beats and washes of thick cloudy pads while Cale's spoken word and repeating refrains of the rain, the rain, the rain, thank God the rain, to be particularly catchy. Even though I haven't heard this album in several days, I still remember that. Tracks like these that had a bit more texture to them would generally be the ones to land better for me. I wish more tracks on here had some more of that stronger body and texture to them like these. it's kind of a tough album to parse. Some of these tracks would just totally bounce off of me without leaving much of any strong impression, and others would make very good use of their minimalistic arrangements. I don't think it comes together as a complete whole as well as it could have. It just kind of feels inconsistent and all over the place, and there are tracks that just didn't interest me and I felt the urge to hit the skip button. But it does also have more hits than misses, and there are some definite stunner moments on this thing, so I guess take that all as you will. I thought it was a good project. If I hang on to this, it's probably not going to be the whole thing, but I'm still definitely glad I took the time to sit with it. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this. Next up, from Rob Clouth, 0 point. You know, the great thing about the Some Stuff I Missed segments is that I can sometimes run into projects that I might not necessarily have much to say about, but still absolutely freaking hit the spot as something special. Like how in the last volume I covered that Nathan Fake project, which now is a pretty solid lock-on for the year-end list. And now here's a project that just totally knocked my socks off right away. Just randomly found it through one mention in my comments that looked semi-intriguing, from an artist who's been at it for a while, but this is his first and only full-length album so far. Ambient IDM type project with sound design and attention to detail on another freaking level. And when I say IDM, I mean the much more modern upscale type of IDM, like along Elon Moore and Coma Duster lines. More low-key than those particular artists, only a bit more low-key than the former. But this is sort of a concept album inspired by quantum mechanics, like how even in a complete vacuum it's impossible for there to be literally zero energy. So in such situations, the vanishingly small bit of energy is called 0 point energy. And this is connected to like chaos theory and entropy, and he explains it better in the Bandcamp description. And that culminates in a mix of sounds pulled from modern techno and ambient styles with an insane micro-level attention to detail that even gives BT a run for his money. And it's also tagged as being like 3D binaural, which may only really apply to the minor details and stuff, but it is a really effective extra touch that gives everything this super expansive stereo depth. Now granted, with these kinds of projects, it can often feel like technical achievements for their own sakes and possibly a lack of solid enough emotional core to really fully stick the landing. We'll get to more of that kind of stuff later in this video. But that was definitely not the case here. I mean, I wouldn't say that the emotional core was as strongly developed as, say, Hudson Lee or False Noise, but all of it feels strangely soothing and laid back, despite how hard-hitting and chaotic it can be. It kind of reminds me of John Hopkins' Insides in that way, that guy at his most oblique and experimental. There's lots of really solid piano arrangements on several tracks, like Casimir or Into or Tunnel Through, the former definitely my favorite cut of all of them, and some tracks that have more minimal techno-influenced synth melodies as seen on Emerging From and The Vacuum State, even if I wouldn't really call the tracks themselves minimal by any stretch. And there's even some particularly gorgeous ambient cuts like The Nothingness Of and the title track, the latter an especially climactic closer to this thing. Also love the creepy atmospherics of Spaces Far Below, which feel like I'm in this giant endless sewer tunnel or something. There's not a ton of structure to these pieces and they just slowly evolve and grow on their own, almost like one big continuous piece. Though obviously not to the point where I can't tell tracks apart from each other. And given so many sound design elements are based off of like random numbers and chaos theory and whatnot, all these sound design elements feel like they're being generated organically, as if occurring in nature, albeit on a sub-microscopic level or something. There are, of course, minor issues and nitpicks I could make. Not every track on here feels like it serves a defined purpose. For instance, there's 2 separate intro tracks, one of which is mostly what sounds like white noise fading in and out, and the other like 38 seconds of glitch sounds. I saw the explanation for how this decision lines up with the concept on his website, and it did kind of make sense, but it's still kind of weird for the album to only feel like it properly got started on track 3. That's a long time for this project to really feel like it got going. Also, the tracks Pareidolik Sequence and A Flickered didn't have as strongly defined an identity as individuals. The former felt like it was rehashing some of the ideas from the previous track, A Schiffer Sequence, almost acting as a direct continuation of sorts. And the latter just didn't really do anything any other track wasn't doing already. Supposedly there's singing on that one, but it's so heavily processed to the point of not being recognizable as singing at all. But still, it's not like I feel the urge to skip any of these tracks. Even though no track on here is like a major tearjerker and often sticks to the most subtle side of this genre, this project still absolutely freaking blew me away with its futuristic spacey atmosphere and insane attention to detail and sound design. This is gonna be on the year-end list for sure. We'll obviously have to see how replay value fares. I've only listened to it like 3 times as of now, but I can see this one really sticking with me long term. This is excellent. I'm overall feeling an 8.7 out of 10. Next up, from Plone, Puzzlewood. Okay, Plone. This is a duo from the UK who were once affiliated with Warp Records, formerly a trio. They appeared once on the We Are Reasonable People compilation in 1998 alongside the likes of Aphex Twin and Square Pusher and Boards of Canada, Nightmares on Wax and Plaid and all the other Warp legends you'll know and love. And shortly after released their debut album, For Beginner Piano, in 1999, a pretty decent little electroacoustic outing that had some nice playful energy. Kind of ended up somewhere between Plaid, Mouse on Mars, and Stereolab, which is an interesting mix. Definitely an interesting mix. Wasn't so blown away by it that I wanted to keep it, but I thought it was pretty cool. Though since then, Plone went completely silent. One half of the project, Mike Bainbridge, focused his efforts in a different group called Sealand, and the other half, Michael Johnston, was part of another project called ZX Spectrum Orchestra, and did some stuff under the name Mike in Mono, and third member Mark Cancellara just left entirely and doesn't seem to have worked on anything else. But completely out of nowhere, the project was revived this past April, again just reduced to a duo, with this comeback album, Puzzlewood. I hadn't actually heard of these guys before this, I only found out about them through some random recommendation in my comments that looked intriguing. Previewed through it a little and thought what I heard sounded really nice, so I plopped it in here. Anyways, I don't think I've ever heard an album quite like Puzzlewood. Think the most overtly quirky thing you've ever heard in your entire life, then think of something quirkier than that, and that's roughly in the same ballpark of quirkiness that Puzzlewood hits. Like, you thought For Beginner Piano was trying to soundtrack a kindergarten classroom. Puzzlewood is a candy box of various electroacoustic vignettes, seemingly inspired by, like, baby toys and little kids' video games. It's so brightly colored, it's like if you took Nick Jr. cartoons and turned the saturation all the way up. There's stuff on here that can almost make Stereolab seem like a downer in comparison, at least unless you're talking about the later Chemical Corps era stuff, in which case it's only a little bit beyond that level. And yeah, I enjoy this a lot as well. If you're like, cause this reminded me of like WarioWare and Rhythm Heaven. It kind of has the same overall aesthetic as that, and that was what pulled me into this as well as it did. And there are also plenty of lower key breather moments that put their bright colors through a sadder and more melancholy lens to help make the goofiest moments that little bit more palatable. We haven't disappeared beyond the uncanny valley of quirky or anything. We did come a little close at some points, but yeah. There were maybe a few moments near the end that got to be a bit much, a bit overbearing in their quirkiness. See all the vocal samples talking about thinking about nothing on Sarcell, or the speak and spell voices congratulating you next to those stock GarageBand stingers on Sweet Factory. Wasn't huge on that one as a closer. And some other tracks prior to that might not have hit as much as I'd like. The chord progression on Build a Small Fire was kind of basic and could be annoying on some listens. Similar thoughts on the title track as well. But when these tracks hit, there's nothing else like them out there. The goofy-ass ragtimey chord progressions with touches of trumpets and vibraphones over the bleepy synths on Miniature Magic. The bubbly, piano-driven, fake band arrangements on Watson's Telescope. The violins on that one especially sound Stereolab-ish in the best way. And Just a Shadow also has the same kinds of swinging up-tempo beats that My Favorite Cuts on Chemical Chords have, and even some kind of similar melodies, albeit with all the buzzing video game synths and boinging sound effects and other weird shit. It's freaking great. And the down-tempo cuts typically hit great too, the lonely pianos on Red Kite, the chill casualness of the vibraphone and plucked string melodies on The Model Village, and Day Trip, which starts out as this kind of strange ethereal ambient piece with tremolo-covered vocal snippets, but then randomly breaking out in this cheery disco tune with stock funk guitar licks and combining the ambient and disco parts back with that groove later. And those are just some of the biggest highlights. As a whole, I think I'm kind of on a similar level with this one that I was with that last Dan Deacon project. Much like with that project, if I'm not in the right mood, then the sheer amount of bright and cheery and colorful can get a bit annoying or sickening. But if I am, then it's a crazy, creative, and nostalgic mind-expanding experience. And I definitely enjoyed this more than the Dan Deacon thing as well. That project may have had more impressive production, but this one just felt like it had a higher baseline level of creativity and attention to detail through every single track. Not to mention the novelty of getting this insane level of goofiness and color and childish weirdness out of these two old IDM guys who used to be like C-tier Warp Records names who never went anywhere. Whatever the case, this is one of the strangest but most pleasant surprises running through this list of random projects. I'll definitely be hanging on to this. We'll probably also get a year-end list honorable mention just by how much it freaking stuck out from the crowd this year. Can't imagine it'll be for everyone, but it's absolutely worth a shot, and I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. Next up, from Give Me Monaco, From the Coral to the Grey. Whoa, sudden out of nowhere lighting change. Whoa. Okay, so, obviously, I was recommended to this by our good friend Ryan of Not Real Music. Shout out to that guy, he's been turning me on to a lot of cool music this year that I never would have checked out otherwise. But yeah, he gave this project a glowing 9 out of 10 review and absolutely loved it. And while shockingly I would not say that I myself was nearly as enthusiastic about this project as he was, I save 9 out of 10s for very, very special occasions. But yeah, I thought this was pretty solid, especially for a no-name artist with pretty much no previous backing or other prior released work as far as I know. This guy just popped in completely out of nowhere and is putting out minimal house projects in the same vein as Juice and Rival Consoles and that kind of thing. And much like the first artist I highlighted in this video, he seems like he should be much higher profile than he actually is. He certainly got the production chops of a more well-established artist. He did apparently also get a cosign from Blue Tech of all people, which is pretty darn cool. Now I will say the minimalism and simplicity of this project was something that needed to grow on me. I first checked this out a few months ago and I just thought it was okay at the time. But then coming back to it to write up this segment, it ended up hitting much more effectively than I remembered. Back when I first heard it, the Juice project was the first and easiest comparison point that came to mind, since not only does it just sound pretty similar, it's sort of leaning on a similar appeal, in that it is a very simple micro-house project that does a lot with a little, but it's not the exact same appeal. This project isn't the same masterwork of pacing that that one was. This is even more direct than that one and tends to have less progression over time, though making up for it with some slightly more engaging and uplifting textures acting as the foundation of these grooves. I'll copy a point from a different fellow reviewer, Buffalo Staple, and say it's a little more akin to something like Deadmau5. Not the kind of artist that would come to mind from like a textural standpoint. Joel is obviously much flashier and more commercial, and this guy is a lot more muted and trying to appeal to a more like lighter down-tempo loving crowd, I guess. But the core appeal is actually very similar, since whatever core melodies and grooves you start with are the thing that the vast majority of these tracks lean on, and any musical surprises are fairly few and far between. And all these tracks definitely have the core fundamentals to back themselves up. It made it particularly tough to pick a least favorite. I thought about picking Satin, but the 5/4 groove of that one was particularly solid and got that to stand out. I thought about Walnut, but I did really like those subtle plinking melodies that run through much of it. And I thought about Goose, since the first 2 minutes or so of that track are pretty dull, but that moment at like right about the 2.5 minute mark where the track just kicks into high gear is maybe the single most exciting moment of the whole album. And everything else in that track beyond that point was really engaging too, ends up turning something meh into a consistent favorite. I decided to go with Ply as my pick for lowest point. Wasn't huge on the humming vocals and somewhat more sour tone of the melodies on that one. And while the former aspect was an interesting texture to set itself apart, it was done better on the opener after show. But I really liked the appropriately subtle melodies and progressions of Subtly, which did really pull me in despite how texturally plain it was, the closest to a track working in the same way as that Juice album. I also love the expansive choirs throughout Oak, and the xylophonish tones on Sheen and its various progressions, which made it a particularly triumphant and satisfying finale to this thing. Yeah, this project was really solid. I don't think I can mark it as like one of my big favorites of the year, especially since it feels like I've listened to more micro house type projects in this year than any other previous one, and there's been at least 3 other albums I've heard in 2020 that sound kinda like this and have left a stronger impression on me. But definitely don't let this one get overlooked either. It's some solid stuff. Very promising debut. We'll be interested to see where this guy goes from here, and I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. Next up, from blank Banshee, GAIA. Okay, so this project popped up completely out of nowhere while I was writing up some segments for this video. I've talked about blank Banshee a few times before. I reviewed his Mega album way back when, and then his next album, Metamorphosis, showed up on the first volume of some stuff I missed. He's an artist that I did really get into at one point, since his stuff helps me get into vaporwave and trap music. Though I haven't had the urge to listen to any of his stuff in a long time. I couldn't really be bothered to go back and revisit those old albums for this segment either. I do remember being pleasantly surprised by the weirder turn towards abstract IDM on his last album though, so I can hope for the best out of this newest one. 16 tracks, just over a half hour, how bad could it be? And he has pretty much exactly what I expected, pretty much just copy-paste all my thoughts on his Mega album from 2016 over to this. It's pretty much that project again. Got some of the organic and Asian influence flares as seen on his last album carrying over as well, but with some more straightforward beats on average, I guess. Highlights, I guess I like the string pads on Blue Marble and Neo Geo, the melodies on Uncanny Valley and Techno Fossil were fun, the drum breaks on Chlorine stuck out in the best way. Aqueduct was a nice sort of ambient sidetrack that made me feel things. Escape went hard as a closer, and Batteries was a good hidden ambient track too. Glad we're out of the CD era so that it can be a hidden track that adds to the ending without fast-forwarding through a long-ass silence. Mind Trap and Fun to My Death have sorta out-of-place, edgy shouting lyrics, possibly from blank Banshee himself. The former was just kind of a goofy turn-off, and the latter, bit of a mood, honestly. Fit almost too well while I was writing this segment after having written 15 others in a row over the course of a few days, and my brain was starting to get burnt out on expressing thoughts on things. I don't feel very strongly about individual tracks on this thing or have any particularly strong feelings on this project in general. If you're already familiar with blank Banshee's previous work, you already know what this sounds like. I'm not going to remember this exists long term and feel like artists like Vale Smith have kind of supplanted my need for a project like this. He does this kind of stuff better if you ask me. But this is all very well produced and enjoyable in the same way all his other stuff is. Nice stuff that can be both soothing and bang, and doesn't require much brain usage. Perfect for this kind of segment. And I liked it. Enough to get away with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up, from ATTLAS, Out Here With You. ATTLAS is an artist on the Mousetrap label who I've been hearing good things about for a few years now and was curious enough to check out. Much like with No Mana earlier this year, this is actually the second album he released this year. He put out a different album called Lavender God back in January, though I didn't bother to listen to it. Feel free to let me know if I was missing anything there. But anyway, this project was pretty solid. Definitely enjoyed this more than I enjoyed that No Mana project. It's a fairly straightforward, atmospheric, progressive house project with a lot of ambient elements kind of brought together by these various voice samples that appear occasionally and sound like they're pulled out of some old movie, I guess. Well, those don't show up as much in the second half of the project, but they're something of note. I barely have anything to actually say about this album at all, but the atmosphere of everything was very well executed for what it was. I did think the ambient and piano-driven pieces like the intro Morning Fields, Ponds, and especially Thunderstorms from the Balcony made from some nice extra flavor and emotion. And in terms of the regular progressive house cuts, there may have been cuts like Ooh Hour and In a Cloud that didn't really do anything interesting or set themselves apart from the crowd. I thought the fittingly chilly atmosphere of Polar Concept was particularly impressive. The ambient synth meanderings of MGT were very nice. The melodic groove of When We Were the Same had me pretty consistently pulled in, and the 10-minute closer and sort of titled track Out There With You was just as good as I hoped it would be, finishing on an emotional high note. This isn't a project that's going to be blowing anyone's minds. It's not especially ambitious or unique in its execution or the kind of thing that I could recognize the style of from a distance, but it did have a lot of heart put into it and it was all well crafted and well produced for what it was, so yeah, I can co-sign this. This was good. Overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up, from KOAN Sound, Polychrome. Okay, this is one of the two projects from this video which is not from 2020 and I decided to put here because it gets requested all the time. So this is the Bristol duo of Jim Bastow and Will Weeks. I saw they've been around since like 2009 or so. Their Twitter is followed by the likes of Disclosure and Hybrid and Amon Tobin and Comaduster and the upscale guys like Hudson Lee and False Noise, among others. On Discogs, this project was marked as glitch hop, drum and bass, UK garage, dubstep, etc. And it was their only full-length album to date, as far as I know, from right at the tail end of 2018. Their Bandcamp page says they portrayed the future of electronic music, which, sure, I'll believe it when I hear it. But yeah, it seems these guys have a pretty widespread fan base already and look to be right up my usual alley, so I gave this a quick shot to see how well the hype was deserved. And after hearing it, I understood right away why people were going nuts over it and why I, in particular, had been recommended it so often. This is another one of those upscale type projects where sound design reigns supreme above everything. Every second of every track is absolutely packed to the brim with glitches and minor details, and the sheer density and intensity is doing its absolute best to just totally knock your socks off, even if the overall vibe it creates is generally pretty chill and laid back, kinda more like what Hudson Lee would go on to do the following year, albeit not nearly as personal or song-oriented. I hype up projects like this as great all the time, and you know what, this is no exception. I thought this project was great. Though I am also drawing a near complete blank on what to actually say on it in more detail than that. In one breath, the sound design is on such a high watermark of impressive that it can carry this thing into 8 out of 10 territory almost all on its own. Though I also kind of feel like weirdly detached from it as well. It's not to as pronounced a level as, say, Tipper's Jettison Mind Hatch, where I could highly respect the sheer amount of work and detail that goes into everything, but on an emotional or aesthetic level, I just kind of found it to be too samey to the point of almost being kind of tedious. This project doesn't wear me out like that one did, and definitely had more core emotion put into it, but I still feel like the main purpose of this project is just purely to wow people with its sound design above everything else. And having heard enough projects in this particular mold over the last couple of years, I feel like the novelty of what it delivers isn't as strong as it might have been maybe when it came out. And even then, we already had Elon Moore's long-awaited Journey the year before this, which, quite frankly, blew me away much more effectively than this did. Still, at the end of the day, this is mainly just me justifying why this isn't being scored even higher than it already is. I still thought this project was great and had lots of standouts. The kind of jazzy pianos going over lots of glitchy synths and opener cobalt, and the fittingly hammering drops of Hustle Hammer do well to set the tone for this album and let you know what this project's all about. Again, giving me pretty strong Hudson Lee vibes. But I think the point at which this project really enters into great territory... What the fuck is wrong with me? But I think the point at which this project really enters into great territory is Chalk It Out, which combines those chill, smooth, jazzy sounds of the opener with some way better and more tangible acoustic-sounding drumming. Had a lot more weight and impact than anything that came before. I loved the funky, hyperspeed slap bass lines of Chili Daddy, even if I'm not huge on that track's title. The melodies and more textured instrumentation on Viridian Dream caught my ear a lot more than preceding tracks. Hydroplane and Drift were super epic and expansive drum and bass excursions, the latter possibly my favorite track in the bunch. And The Zula was a nice, refreshing closer with all its layers of blinking xylophones and chimes and kalimbas, like Frequent meets Rum Pistol or something. And even other tracks that might not have been standouts here could have been standouts on other, less consistently impressive albums. Virtual Light created some fairly impressive synth-heavy ambience, Zhongmyo made for a solid low-key Asian-flavored breather moment, and Prism Pulse, okay, that one was just kind of there and didn't really stick out to me as anything special in the greater scheme of the album, but I guess still hit the same baseline of quality and detail that the rest of the album hit. It's a really all-around solid project and could have ended up on my 2018 year-end list as an honorable mention if I had heard it back then. While I think there are several other projects in this vein that I've heard over the years that did a lot more to impress me or felt like they had more of a human element at their core, just as an example, that Rob Clouth project I talked about earlier in this video may have had a more pretentious concept attached to it and similar focus on insanely detailed sound design, but weirdly it didn't feel like it was trying as hard to wow you and focus more on building immersive atmosphere that I could get into, and had more emotion behind the arrangements on average. This feels like it's trying to be a big technical achievement above all else, and isn't unique sounding enough to wow me in that particular way, at least not consistently. But, whatever, I guess I'm just being a little nitpicky. Not sure how often I'm gonna want to come back to this in the future, but I definitely feel like the project's hype is mostly merited, and it's definitely worth giving a shot if you haven't already. I'll let it get away with a solid 8 out of 10. Next up, from Ólafur Arnalds, Some Kind of Peace. Okay, so this guy is an Icelandic electronic modern classical composer. He used to be regular on Erased Tapes Records and has worked with Nils Fram a few times. He's not on the same label anymore. Now he's on Mercury KX, and admittedly I haven't heard any of his other albums. I have heard good things about Remember? I haven't heard that one yet. But when I saw this project came out and featured people like Bonobo on it, I decided to drop it in here and see how it went. Nice to have a modern classical type project in here for a change of pace. I always enjoy something like that every once in a while. Just a shame this left so little impression on me. Yeah, I don't know what to say or what's missing from the equation. Typically, I quite enjoy piano-driven projects that occasionally bring in violins and other strings and combine it with occasional synths like this one does. If an electronic artist implements modern classical elements like these, I'm typically a sucker for that kind of thing. But, I don't know, this one was just kind of there and didn't really draw in my interest much or get me as emotionally invested as I would have wanted. Not to say this thing didn't have its moments. I thought still/sound was very nice, slowly evolving from its first half of plucking synths into a second half of pianos and violins. The track with JFDR, Back to the Sky, was very enjoyable, and her vocals added a lot to the mix and some much-needed variety. Spiral and New Grass were nicely textured piano and string pieces with some nice swell and emotion to them, and even if I did not like the spoken word thing at the beginning of Undone, the piece that follows did get some solid emotional resonance that ended up working for me much better. But still, there's a lot of meh tracks on here too. I thought the track with Bonobo, Loom, was kind of a letdown. His shifting, minimal synths were not particularly evocative or interesting, and it was a weirdly non-indicative opener as well that stuck out like a sore thumb. I thought the pianos on Woven Song were quite nice, but did not at all care for the yelpy, off-rhythm, off-key singing on that one. The lo-fi filter on the singing could lessen its annoyance, but still, that performance was pretty rough. The track with vocals from Gnossienne, The Bottom Line, wasn't nearly as impactful as Back to the Sky and passed right by without really leaving an impression on me. Again, not sure why this didn't work and that did. Maybe just JFDR's a more interesting sounding singer, I don't know. And Zero and We Contain Multitudes were just minimal, dreamy piano pieces that mostly just had me kind of bored and checked out. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I was really hoping this would do more for me, and there were isolated moments that worked, but I mostly found myself checked out on this one. I've seen plenty of people say they really got into this one way more than I did, so it may still be worth a shot. I wish I could better pin down what specifically didn't work, besides just saying I didn't get that emotionally invested, but that's basically all that comes to mind to say. Maybe it'll resonate for you, but I just thought it was alright, personally. Overall feeling a 6.3 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Comanavago, Heart Failure. He's on my heart. Here's a project that's been going around the small-time YouTube critic circles. First heard about it when Rick Valai covered it in one of his roundups. Not Real Music did a whole interview with the band too, and I feel like I've seen other people cover it, albeit not one with a bigger subcount than my own. Liam Music Reviewer covered it, Noise Pond covered it, I'm sure there's others. But yeah, I heard this was apparently a really solid synth-pop project. There was a lot of positive buzz around it, so I decided to drop it in here. And after hearing it, okay, wow, I can co-sign every little bit of hype these guys got. Yeah, this was freaking great. Certainly way better synth pop than Erasure and the Pet Shop Boys could deliver this year. 11 tracks, 40 minutes, pretty much all hits and no misses. Maybe Angel because it came right after Rains and sounded pretty similar while not as good. And I got afraid for a second that every track was gonna have like trap-ish percussion patterns. Though thankfully then Annihilation came in to quell that fear. Maybe there's a few tracks that would take a while to really get going, like All I Want or Mess. But those moments are about as close as we get to a miss. This was really damn impressive. I don't really have much to break down about this project in terms of specific details. Most of the appeal of this project is right there in front of your face when you hit the play button. First thing that immediately sticks out is how freaking great the lead singer is. Really expressive and extroverted voice, and hits every note perfectly. And the instrumentals are all loud and blaring, perhaps somewhat influenced by this newfangled hyperpop thing that all the gosh darn kids are talking about. But the bombastic loudness of these tracks is never remotely to an overbearing extent. Everything is meant to serve the core tunes and does all of it pretty well. There's even one track with a guest singer called Ketty Perry, Ketty, apparently a friend of the band as well. She's great too and makes for a nice contrast to the lead singer. Kinda wish she'd appeared more often on this thing. I don't really have much to say about this thing, though there wasn't a single track on here that I didn't like. While these tracks don't sound different enough for me to have detailed thoughts on each one, they do sound different enough that I'm not going to be mistaking any of them for each other. They all have their own rhythms and killer hooks to set themselves apart. There are, of course, still some welcome breather moments, like In Love or Dreams, that pull themselves back a bit, even if they still often slap as well. Not sure if this is going to end up on the year-end list. Straight synth-pop projects without any more abstract moments like these, regardless of actual quality, tend not to get a ton of replay value out of me personally. But if you've missed this one before like I did, that's definitely worth remedying. The hype is very much well-founded here. Great project. Solid 8 out of 10. Next up from Andrea, Ritorno. Okay, Andrea is an artist from, as you might guess, Italy. He's been on the Alien Tape label that I know best for Ski Mask's Compro, and I think has actually been on the label longer than that guy, though this is his first full-length album. I don't actually pay that close attention to the Alien Tape label myself, but I found out this project exists when I saw it in a recent album roundup on the Sound Binges channel, and I threw it on here. And yeah, this does in fact sound a lot like Ski Mask. Very similar mix of foggy and metallic but dreamlike ambience, similar sounding 90s artificial intelligence era synth pads going over breakbeats and letting the atmosphere and groove of everything carry any given track. Very much doing its best to recapture the same kind of appeal. Now, perhaps unfortunately, the overall experience is not nearly as striking, memorable, or varied as Compro. While there are moments on here up to par with the material on that project, this one had much more of a tendency to just go in one ear and out the other and kinda run together in a nondescript blur. Maybe more like Ski Mask's first album, Shred, which also wasn't nearly as good as that follow-up for similar reasons. Not gonna lie, through much of the early middle part of this album, I found myself pretty checked out. There may have been occasional standouts in the first half. The foggy ambience and breaks of Skylin were quite nice. The dark webbing groove of track QI was solid. I suppose the intro track Attimo with all its ambient washes was alright too, but much of the rest of the first half was a snooze fest. The melodies were meh, the grooves were all competently constructed and fine for what they were, but nothing attention-grabbing. It just felt like I was listening to less interesting Ski Mask, and I was about ready to mark this into the low 6 range and just move on unimpressed. But then came in the last 5 tracks, which managed to save this project single-handedly. The melodic flares on backdrops were way brighter and more striking than anything else that came before. Reminded me a tiny bit of BT's The Road to Lost Withiel, or maybe Ski Mask's Flyby VFR if you want to go for the more obvious comparison. The similar melodies going over some of the more wubbing bass grooves on Liquid were plenty of fun and would pop out to me more with each successive listen. The plucked progressions on Isabel's String were the closest this project had to a catchy hook, and it worked very nicely. Twin Forests had this really creative, chopped up, bouncing breakbeat going over some thick ambient pads that really sonically stuck out from everything else in the best way. And Lana was the big emotional finale with its plinking bell melodies going over all its fuzzy pads and typical banging breaks. Just had me like, man, if only the rest of this album was as consistently on the same level as these last 5 cuts. I still can't call this album great by any stretch. It's much too inconsistent to fully sign off on as something truly special. But it did really stick the landing for that whole final stretch. I guess it's still worth a shot if you're curious and you really like Ski Mask. Andrea may mostly sound like that guy, but he did manage to get enough good out of this to not feel like he was stepping on his toes or anything. So take that all as you will. Probably not hanging on to this, but I thought it was pretty nice, and I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from William Basinski, Lamentations. Alright, William Basinski is an ambient composer best known for his 4-part album series, The Disintegration Loops, from the early 2000s. I've gotten a few requests to talk about these projects before in years previous. I myself have only fully listened through the first volume and briefly sampled through the other 3 and haven't heard anything else he's put out, but I feel like the disintegration loops in particular don't really play well into my typical review format. It's a 4+ hour ambient project that takes constantly repeating tape loops of what sounds like melancholy brass orchestral pieces and lets them slowly get damaged and glitched up over time until they disappear completely, and there's pretty much nothing else to it beyond that. Either you're gonna get into its mood or you're not, and while I enjoyed what I heard for what it was and could see how the whole thing is like a metaphor for the inevitability of death and all that, I wish I could say I found it as impactful as so many people have made it out to be. It's not even close to a 10 out of 10 pitchfork. Had me wondering if the association with 9/11 imagery was doing most of the heavy lifting for people and not so much the music itself, which, while definitely nice, wasn't anything that deep or mind-blowing to me. And I feel like in order for me to get into it most effectively, I need to be in a very specific mood. Also, if I am in that mood, I feel like I'd be more likely to pick up Biosphere's Shenjo or something instead. Much stronger personal connection there and way more digestible pacing, even if the tape loops don't get damaged in that one. But still, when I saw Fantano cover this project and saw that it had a more standard-looking track listing with tracks only ranging from less than 2 minutes to 11 minutes, looks to be more easily digestible, I decided to just plop it in here and see how I felt. Couldn't hurt to give it a shot. Now, on the topic of Biosphere, you remember how that guy had one single project that I thought was trash called L'Incarnazione de Popea? It was billed as being glitch opera, taking loops of old opera samples and running most of them through this overbearing tremolo filter that was really distracting and undercut the entire mood that Biosphere was presumably going for. Imagine if you had a project with the same general idea turned into an actual good album. No annoying filter, much better fleshed out and varied, and that's roughly what we get with Lamentations. I suppose the glitch opera concept really only applies to the last 3 tracks on this thing, and I kind of have mixed feelings on that final stretch. They're probably the part of the album I least enjoy, but also the most emotionally devastating part as well. I should mention that I do not actually care for opera singing much in general. That kind of stuff creeps me out, especially since these last pieces are like in a major key, attempting to be more comforting, but it does the exact opposite of that for me. Listening to these pieces makes me feel like I'm close to death, which I'm guessing was kind of the whole point. And as you might guess, with each one of these tracks, they get more and more deteriorated and glitched up. All These Two I Love is the least manipulated one while running on at 11 minutes. I don't actually mind the length, since there is some change over time in full segments without the opera singer, just the orchestral backdrop, and those parts are more actually comforting. But the parts of this track with the singing are some of the most anxiety-inducing stuff on the whole album and in this entire roundup. Please, this shit has got to stop. Does way more manipulation and glitching up, the singing coming out and leaving at various unpredictable intervals. A more interesting piece, I suppose, but not any less anxiety-ridden for me. And the closer, Finn, technically doesn't have any opera in it. It's basically just formless, incomprehensible tape glitches, and the point at which the piece is fully deteriorated into nothing. Say what I will about this ending stretch, even if I don't personally enjoy it much, it is the part that left the strongest emotional impact on me, and I don't feel like I can mark its effect against the album as a whole. It accomplished exactly what it set out to do. The rest of the album, though, I enjoyed much more. Most of it takes these kinds of orchestral snippets and melts them into formless, dark, ambient drone pieces, lacking in much textural definition. The 2 where the orchestral pieces are the most obviously defined are actually my 2 favorites. The Wheel of Fortune is a melted mix of string and woodwind sounds that does convey some palpable sense of warmth to contrast with the rest of the album. And Oh My Daughter, Oh My Sorrow, that one does bring back the opera singing, slowly fading it in through a cloud of orchestral ambience and giving it more and more definition. And I don't know why, but the singing here wasn't even close to as anxiety-inducing as the album's final stretch was. I suppose that since the singing was a bit more reserved here, and the chord progressions were more minor key and sad and unresolved, and the singing fit so well into the ambient pads built around it, hard for me to put my finger on it, but yeah, these 2 tracks were easily my favorites here. And there are, of course, some much darker and airier pieces with even less textural definition. Tracks like Paradise Lost, Passio, Punch and Judy, Silent Spring, and Transfiguration turn such snippets into dissonant and formless drones that create this creepy sense of emptiness that gives me the same vibes as something like the Submachine soundtrack. Silent Spring is maybe a little dull in how little texture or definition it has. And Paradise Lost is much too short to leave a strong impact on me, but the other ones I really liked the borderline metallic environment they created. And there are other tracks that don't quite fit into any of these molds, like the ambient pads of the opener from Whom the Bell Tolls, which sounds a lot more synth-driven than other tracks on here. It might not actually be synths, and rather just the snippets have become that formless, but it still does kind of sound a bit more synth-ish to me. Same with Tear Vial, which technically has an actual rhythm to its lonely, plucking, melancholy chords. Sounds somewhere between tape manipulation and synth melodies, and it's hard to tell, but I did quite like it all the same. But yeah, that's Lamentations. I don't think I'm going to be hanging on to this project long term or getting much of any replay value out of it outside of the listens I gave for this video. But all of it is really well done for what it is and really emotionally affecting. The first 9 tracks are really immersive dark drones that pulled me in quite effectively, and the last 3 are a giant ball of glitchy opera-driven anxiety that I might not fully enjoy, but definitely respect for how harrowing they are. As far as ambient releases go, this is some really solid stuff, and I definitely recommend giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up, from Cut Copy, Freeze Melt. Alright, Cut Copy are a 4-piece Australian band who are best known for making earnest 80s synth-pop pastiche that's so accurate to the time period that it could trick my dad into thinking it actually came from that decade. I remember finding their 2008 album In Ghost Colors to be really freaking solid, and it's kind of just stuck around with tracks like Lights and Music and Nobody Lost, Nobody Found being pretty big nostalgia buttons. And I've had these guys' back catalog just lying on my iPod for like 8 years or something now, hoping to check out the other projects but just never got around to it. But now that I have these roundups, I decided to throw them in here and just see where I stood on the rest of their catalog, figuring I probably wouldn't have much to say, but just wanted to have thoughts down on the record. So for the sake of tying up that one little personal loose end, here's a super quick rundown of their previous 5 studio albums. Nice mix of 80s synth pop rock and disco with cool bass lines. It's alright but not hanging onto it. Like the last album but significantly better in every conceivable way, this still totally holds up. Like the last album but more inconsistent and long-winded, has its moments though, really went out with a bang. Much more old school centric house take on their sound, a lot better than I expected it to be, might actually hang on to this. Sounds like all their other albums but not as memorable, you can probably skip it. Which brings us to here, yeah, these guys are pretty hit and miss. I guess they've switched between being alright to really good with each successive album. The last one was mid, so hopefully the pattern would continue and this one would be better. And actually, yeah, it was pretty nice. I actually wasn't going in expecting this to be anything special, and I still wouldn't say I'm so blown away with it that I see myself hanging on to any of it beyond this video. But yeah, I would rank it among their better projects. A bit of an interesting turn towards some more chilled out and ambient-centric sounds. At least marginally so, a lot of it still sounds like the same kind of synth-pop lens you'd expect out of them. But it did definitely manage to form its own identity in their catalog. I really like how some of these tracks have some more abstract flares to them, and how they can start out as strange down-tempo compositions and build into their typically solid synth-pop grooves as they go on, like how Cold Water starts out as light Tangerine Dream synth arpeggios, Stop Horizon is mostly a mix of guitar plucking, and Running in Grass has all these xylophones plinking all over the place, but all of these tracks eventually turn into really solid and grooving tunes in their own right. Also really liked Rain and its increasingly grander and more impressive arrangements as well. Not every track is that notable. There are some tracks here like Love Is All We Share that just kind of feel like straightforward ballads and aren't that interesting. And In Transit was kind of an underwhelming closer too, despite being all instrumental and having a pretty interestingly textured last minute or so. Also, I think I'd be lying if I said I found this project to be among the catchiest work they've ever done either. But still, I do kind of like how this project has a similar appeal to something like Erasure self-titled. Still ostensibly a synth-pop project, but isn't afraid to have its stranger and more meditative moments to flesh everything out. I don't actually have anything else to break down for this. It's not a project that has much of anything in the way of discussion material, but I was all around pleasantly surprised by this, and if it sounds interesting to you, it's worth giving a shot. I'm giving it a solid 7 out of 10. Next up, from Punch Cards, Visage. Alright, here's the most last-minute addition to this roundup. This project came out the day after I wrote the previous segment, and I was curious about it before, just wasn't sure if it was actually going to be out in time for me to put here. But it made it out just in time, so for those unfamiliar with this small-time IDM artist from the UK, I have actually talked about her work a few times before. In 2018, her second album, Indigo Beats, got an honorable mention on my year-end list, and in early 2019, I did a proper review of her fourth album, the Amy Gibbon LP, as a Patreon request. The latter project was admittedly a pretty frustrating one, since while I did find it to be a bit too unwieldy and stuffed with redundant tracks that retreaded the same territory and weighed the experience down too much, had it been cut down, it could have been easily her strongest and most exciting work yet. I actually still have the album on my iPod to this day, albeit cut down to the 8 best tracks, since I think that made for a much more streamlined experience that did much better to fulfill that project's full potential. Still, given the amount of potential she'd shown on previous projects like these, I was of course interested in hearing what she'd deliver for this newest one. The album was only 7 tracks this time around, not including 3 bonus tracks tacked on, obviously much tighter and more to the point than the last one. Hopefully it'd fare better. And I will say right off the bat, this project does sound notably different from her previous stuff. Not to say it's unrecognizable as the same artist or anything, but her previous 4 albums did cover a lot of similar territory and build on her typical blend of dark IDM and techno. And this project does still cover that usual sound on a few tracks, but it also branches out a lot more, delving into ambient drone type stuff as well as old school drum and bass and jungle. Maybe even a hint of vaporwave as well. Despite the much shorter track listing, there's a lot more variety here than I think any of her previous albums. I definitely wouldn't have said that Punch Cards was exactly lacking in an artistic identity on her previous projects. Maybe she could wear her influences on her sleeve, as most obscure Bandcamp artists do. But this project does show a lot more growth and dimensionality to her sound than I was expecting. It's probably her most creative and out-of-the-box release yet. Also probably her most stripped back, sparse, and low-key on average, though obviously still having time for plenty of moments that are notably more exciting and unpredictable. A lot of these tracks just seem to meander around and do whatever the hell they want, often containing multiple change-ups that sometimes can build up fairly naturally, but other times come completely out of left field. Take the opener and title track, probably my favorite track in the bunch. This track starts out with a bunch of these reverb-covered metallic percussive sound effects that sound like they could have been field recordings or something, slowly forming their own groove and regular rhythmic patterns, then being joined by some more characteristic dramatic synth pad progressions and some fast-paced breakbeats. The mix of all these sounds is really compelling and pulled me in really well. The melodies were all really solid too. Though then there's also this random sidetrack into all these beatboxing sounds at one point that isn't led into at all and kind of abruptly shifts back to where the mix was before as if that segment never happened. Weird moment for sure, and this project has no shortage of moments like that. But I like them. This album definitely keeps you on your toes and constantly has you guessing where any track is gonna go next. Like how a track like Something Beyond Words can start out with creepy field recordings that sound like you're in some empty subway station with people whispering around you, and then randomly switching into all these chopped up breakbeats from It Takes Two by Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock, and then randomly switching into these other old low-key 80s synth pop samples that I don't recognize and working them into the groove of breakbeats as well, or its companion track Something Beyond Sight, which switches from distorted bass to blipping dark synth progressions to field recordings of people shouting, or high-pitched piano going over super sped up breakbeats to what sounds like 2 guys rapping in a bathroom or something. And they've got a pretty solid flow too. This project gets pretty nuts in the most fun way. There are still a few tracks that, as I mentioned, kind of default to her old dark ambient techno sound, see Zippo especially, which would have fit right at home on the Amy Gibbon LP, with its dark synth melodies and string pads and drum and bass beats. But she's doing that sound really well as usual, and the fact that it's kind of the only track on the album that sounds like that definitely works to its benefit. Well, that and Yami has a lot of her usual synth melodies and tones, but that one also has a bunch of these really intense and edgy distorted bass stabs and other hyper-distorted sounds, also covered in reverb and various strange sidetracks into chaotic breakbeats and other weird noises. That track definitely stands out in the track listing as one of the most exciting and unpredictable moments on here. Feels like we're getting new sounds introduced out of nowhere every few seconds. There's also Blame But Myself, which is a nice emotional MIDI piano tune sunk in all her usual synth pads, which is a nice device to break up the darker and more experimental sounds of the rest of the album, though not to the point of throwing off the pacing or feeling out of place. And then there's the 13-minute closer Stillness, an almost entirely ambient piece that definitely has plenty of interesting sidetrack moments, and enough to keep my interest, but most of the most interesting moments are in the second half of the track. The first 5 minutes or so kind of sticks to the same ambient subspace, and after so many strange and constantly changing pieces, it maybe did feel a bit off-putting to finish with a piece that felt notably more slow-paced. But even this track was still solid and did have some real emotional resonance. It was a fittingly solid closer all the same. On first listen, I found it to be maybe a little anticlimax, but it definitely grew on me later. Yeah, this album was just all around a lot of fun. It's certainly not her most cohesive work. This project just goes every which way and may not always feel like these tracks directly service each other or come together as a greater whole, but there's no misses on this project or moments that lost my interest, and I can't say the particular mix of styles is quite like any other project I've heard off the top of my head. Not to mention, it does feel like the actual production level was a step up from previous projects as well. The mixing and mastering was much better done than something like the Amy Given LP, which still often sounded like a less experienced bedroom producer and could be on the harsh and tinny side. This project, while in one breath the wonky pacing and fragmented mix of synths and samples and cut-ups are the kind of thing you'd only find out of small-time Bandcamp artists like her, this just had a much stronger command over its atmosphere and grooves. And yeah, this might end up being my favorite album of hers to date. Not sure if I'm going to have room for it on the year-end list given how many other great projects we've had this year, but I can definitely give it my recommendation. Certainly it's a unique experience that'll take you on a very strange but all-around compelling ride that's worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. Next up, from Major Lazer, Music is the Weapon. Well, I can't believe this album actually exists. Major Lazer were obviously a huge recognizable force in the early 2010s EDM scene and how they would combine their aggressive commercial style with a lot of various Jamaican influences. I remember first finding out about them way back when their second album, Free the Universe, was everywhere, and generally finding it pretty fun for what it was, despite being really all over the place and the existence of bubble butts. And then their third album, Peace is the Mission, was even a significantly bigger hit, what with it having their most recognizable hit, Lean On it. And the project was somewhat deservedly locked at the top of the iTunes electronic charts for a good 2 years or so, until Odessa's A Moment Apart came in to end that streak. But despite a few singles here and there in the years following Peace is the Mission and some possible hints at that fourth album coming at some point, Major Lazer had gone silent for years. And now that this album is just suddenly here, they're way beyond their peak irrelevance or the point at which anyone would actually care about it. I mean, how many people actually knew that this album finally came out this year? I don't think it made much of any splash at all. I never got a single request to talk about this. Diplo even put out a random ambient album this year that nobody cares about, and I feel like that turned more heads than this did. Still, given there was once quite a bit of hype for this album many years ago, I had to give it a shot out of morbid curiosity if nothing else. Wasn't going in with super high expectations. All the previous Major Lazer projects have been major mixed bags at best. But maybe given they're so far past their prime, they wouldn't have as much impetus to pander towards current trends and just do their own thing instead. Now, who am I kidding that was ever gonna happen? Especially given all the trendy reggaeton guest features that made this thing look like a new Steve Aoki project or something. I was expecting this to be a half-assed trash fire that no one had their heart put into, and after hearing it, I don't think it'd be fair to call this project a trash fire, because that would imply it failed in an interesting or entertaining way. I think it would be more accurate to just call it trash. This was just total flavorless radio filler boredom for the most part. Absolutely nothing you haven't heard on the radio a million times, especially if you were to turn on like a Latin-focused station or something. There was one track that I did actually find pretty funny in how crap it was. Oh My God, with Nicki Minaj and K4Mo and Mr. Easy. Whoever was handling the hook on that one sounded like he had his mouth full. Talk about, knock knock, who's coming to dinner, and oh my god, I never see a bottom like this. I mean, it could have been a runoff from David Guetta's 7 album. It seems like they wanted to recapture Bubble Butt for some reason. But I'll give them that did in fact generate a reaction. And Rave de Favela was also kind of notable in his shittiness, with the main rapper mostly going off in Spanish, and then randomly sticking English words in, like fuck and sex out of nowhere. And there's also like a weak, lifeless Big Room House drop. But yeah, most of this album is just boring as hell. It's all just super formulaic reggaeton and tropical house crossover attempts, forgettable feature after forgettable feature, not even any particularly catchy hooks. I guess the track with Alessia Cara was fine. There's a track with Marcus Mumford for some reason, which sounds like a commercial. There's a track with Skip Marley that has a particularly awful fart-sounding drop on it. The penultimate track, Jadi Booty, with all its super fake horns and random string samples, was almost enjoyable until the drop, which totally sucked. I suppose this project is inoffensive enough that I can't bring myself to get outright mad at it, but there's just nothing here to care about at all. It's pure capitalism and no creativity. I haven't listened to Free the Universe or Pieces of the Mission in years, but I remember those projects at least being interesting and having their own sound and style in the greater context of the EDM scene at the time. This stuff is completely anonymous and flavorless. It's just a total waste of time that has like no discussion material. It's kind of depressing actually. Whether or not you were ever interested in Major Lazer to begin with back in the old days, I really can't recommend it to anyone. All this project does is highlight how much they've completely lost anything that might have made them worth caring about. They can't even be annoying in an interesting or novel way. The nicest thing I can say is that if I heard tracks from here playing on a random radio station at a store or something, they wouldn't be noticeable enough to make me want to leave. But yeah, this was terrible and kind of made me feel dumb for ever having any expectations of quality from Diplo and company at this point. Overall feeling a 3.3 out of 10. Next up from Richie Houghton, Time Warps. Alright, Richie Houghton did a thing a few weeks ago. This guy is obviously best known for his work under the alias Plastic Man. I highlighted his 1998 album Consumed in my Greatest of All Time list addendum, and own a CD of his DE9 Transitions DJ mix, which I'd probably hold up as the single smoothest continuous mix I've ever heard in my entire life. Guy is just one of the most recognizable and game-changing names in the world of minimal techno and just techno in general. So when I heard that he had a new EP out under his own name, I decided to give it a shot out of curiosity. Figured I wasn't going to have much of anything to say about it, given it is just 2 tracks running on for about 17-18 minutes each. And also given Houghton's style has always tended towards the very minimal and simplistic. Not really the kind of thing well suited to proper dedicated videos. But I decided to stick this in here anyway, because A, I figured I enjoyed it, it'd be really easy to digest and get through, and B, I needed to get the number of segments in this video up to around number 30 after deleting a different segment for a meh album that I didn't feel like highlighting. But anyway, this Time Warps EP was roughly as fun to listen as I expected it to be. These tracks, as you might expect, don't really have a lot of progression over time, nor ridiculously repetitive and straightforward. Pretty standard fare for Houghton, and I think it would be a stretch to call them attention-grabbing. But the grooves are consistently well constructed and easy to get into, as you hopefully also expect. I mean, if there's anyone who can put a project with 2 18-minute tracks that are mostly just the same techno grooves the entire time but still keeps you satisfied, it's gotta be Richie Houghton. Between the 2 tracks, I definitely preferred Time Stands Still. It had an actual chord progression and some plunky melodic arpeggios and acidish textures later on I liked. And it's even percussionless for more than half the track's running time, yet still forming that groove. When the percussion finally does come in about 10 minutes in or so, it's a great freaking moment. Even if some of the clap sounds could be a bit off-putting in how brittle they sound. Though the title track was plenty of fun too, had much more of a consistently banging groove to it, with similarly propulsive kicks and techno beats. I mean, there's absolutely nothing in this project that revealed anything new to me that I didn't already know about Richie Houghton, and if you don't have the patience for this kind of minimal techno, you're probably going to be totally bored by this. But I had plenty of fun with it. I knew exactly what I was going to get, and I got it. If you're already a fan of Richie Houghton and this caught your interest, it's probably worth a shot. This was fun. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this. Next up, from the Polish ambassador, Time's Running In. The Polish ambassador. It's been a minute since I've talked about this guy. I have done 2 proper videos on him in the past. I covered his Dreaming of an Old Tomorrow and Color of Flight albums. The latter even got a spot on my year-end list for 2017. I skipped reviewing his last proper album, Twilight Safari, from 2018. Thought it was another fine addition to his run of world music-influenced projects with a hip-hop-centric twist, if maybe not so blown away with it that I felt like putting together a proper video on it that I had a feeling people weren't going to be clicking on anyways. But now that I have these roundups, this feels like a better place for me to talk about his stuff. I had a pretty good feeling on what I was getting with this project. Probably going to be the usual mix of down-tempo and hip-hop and electro and world music. That's been his usual MO since 2012. Hoped I would enjoy it, and it was okay, I guess. Okay, I will say right off the bat I was kind of disappointed by how trendy and run-of-the-mill the percussion patterns always seem to be. Either just straightforward trap rhythms or reggaeton rhythms. It was like he was trying to get this kind of stuff on the radio or something and brought down nearly every single track on this thing. I suppose the overblown synth bass on every track sounded more like a product of like 2000s crunk era hip-hop, but it still often felt kinda uncreative and cheap. And there were always a lot of things to like about these tracks. The production was always super clean and well done for what it was. They'd have all the usual world music textures to keep things interesting, plenty of different strange tribal percussion, sitars, eastern flutes, saxophones, and other various vocal samples, sometimes in English and sometimes not, whatever else applicable. For everything to go over such generic-sounding radio-friendly hip-hop beats just had me like, really? Was this the best you could come up with? Just as an example, one track that came very close to being a big favorite of mine was The Wrong Side of the Universe. There were so many cool sounds going into this one. I really loved the piano and glockenspiel combination it started with, and it created this really heartfelt and emotional moment, but then suddenly it switched over into this goofy sounding drop with all the bass removed, and stuck to those kinds of sounds for most of the remaining running time. Still had plenty of interesting textures introduced to keep things interesting, but the vibe it created before was just totally ruined. I suppose there technically weren't any tracks here that offered nothing at all for me. The bass lines on Mystery Science Heater and Silence is Foldin' were cool. The tracks with guest features felt a lot more natural and like everything fit together better, Mystic Matters being the stronger of the two, having a more energetic beat, but Blue, Black, and Hip Hop not being too bad either, and capturing that kind of 2000s rap sound pretty well in a way that wasn't cringy. I thought Two Step and Eastern Eyes, Western Skies were probably the two biggest high points, as they never got too generic sounding, and the world music instrumentation would take more of the focus. Also, the former had among the most energetic and danceable grooves. But man, aside from that, this was a pretty big letdown. I know the Polish ambassador has had these sorts of influences in his sound for years now, even some of the hip-hop influences were there since the beginning. But this project took those kinds of sounds and just made them feel unimaginative and gimmicky, and it was just not nearly as fun to listen as he can usually deliver. Not a bad project by any stretch, still typically well produced and has plenty of creative ideas that only he would have tried to do, but I can't fully sign off on this when I know he's capable of so much better. Solid 6 out of 10 on this. Next up from Dosem, Dream Decoder. Dosem is an artist from Spain, currently signed to Anjuna Deep. I plopped this into the list because I saw it featured in the electronics section of iTunes one day and thought the album cover looked cool. It is a pretty dang cool album cover, you gotta admit. Wasn't expecting anything super out of the box from previews I heard. Figured I was just gonna get a collection of straightforward, easily digestible ambient tech house and progressive house that I didn't have to think about too hard. And yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I got. Absolutely nothing astonishing or out of the box, or the kind of thing that I haven't already heard plenty of stuff like over the years, but also perfectly well constructed and produced for what it is. All the atmosphere is well done, immersive, easy to get into, all the grooves are propulsive and hard-hitting as they needed to be. Most of my biggest favorites tend to be the tracks with heavier grooves and bass lines like Megacities and Tower and Pleasures, though there were also some solid ambient-centric cuts like Magma and Still on My Mind. I also thought Eternal Summer was fittingly bright and melodic and was a particular standout in that way. There's even two pretty solid cuts with some breakbeats on them in Take Me Back and Too Early Too Late that I quite enjoyed as well. I suppose I would say this album could have been a bit stronger with a bit more cutting down, like there's ambient intro and outro tracks with Soul Window and Other Lives respectively that feel pretty redundant and unnecessary. If you took them out entirely, the project would still be bookended by ambient-centric cuts, and much stronger ones as well. And maybe there's a meh filler track here and there like Acceptance or Unclosed that doesn't add that much of interest. But none of these issues really got in the way of my enjoyment too much. Even the lowest points on here were perfectly serviceable. I obviously didn't go into this expecting anything mind-blowing or even something that had much of any discussion material, but I do always enjoy me a straightforward ambient progressive house project like this every now and then. If you're a fan of artists like Shifo, you'll probably be into this as well, and I definitely had fun with it myself. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this. And finally, from Culprate, Deliverance. And now now, let's finish this roundup with one last project, not from 2020. It's from all the way back in 2014 and has been requested by lots of different people over many years. Way too many people have been regularly bugging me about this album since at least 2016 or 2017. So I decided to finally cave and check it out. I have not heard this guy's other albums. I just know this is the one everyone talks about. It often gets brought up when I talk about being into upscale artists, or maybe some more modern drum and bass styles. Clearly, if people are still talking about it to this day, then it would have to be something special. Now, of course, whenever I go into an album like this that has that insane amount of bandwagon hype, I tend to go in with an even more critical mindset than usual. Someone tells me an album I've never heard is a 9 or a 10 or one of their all-time favorites, I go into it thinking, there's no way it's going to be that good for me as well. And a lot of people have hyped this project up as one of their favorites of all time. I was really hoping that this would wow me on the same level that everyone said, but given how my brain works around these kinds of releases, I probably wouldn't be quite as overly enthusiastic. Not to say I wasn't still excited to get into it. I saw the long credits list of live musicians that worked on this project and the more unique instrumentation being directly credited, like Cora and Harmonium and whatever else applicable. That's always a good sign. So yeah, I was pretty hyped to finally check this out, if sorta tempering my expectations. And after hearing it, I immediately understood every little bit of hype this thing amassed. So obviously this is another project in that upscale sort of vein, that kind of modern, hyper-detailed, glitchy IDM mixing with elements of modern dubstep and drum and bass and the like, the style we all know from artists like Lazer and Frequent and KOAN sound, as I went through earlier in this video. But imagine that kind of sound combined with Spangle. Fill everything with lots of lush world music instrumentation and atmospheric ambient touches as seen on all those guys' projects. Maybe like Tipper's Broken Soul Jamboree as well. You combine those two worlds, that's Culprate's Deliverance. And it is definitely a ride, to say the least. Now, it is of course worth noting that I did kind of have similar feelings to this that I did to KOAN Sound's album. In that, once again, as someone who was really late to the train on this, I've heard other albums since that have wowed me in similar ways, and as such I probably missed out on the novelty of what it was like when it came out. It is way more excusable in the case of this album, though, because again, it came out back in 2014. And I know, well, there really wasn't anything like it to compare it to back then. Pretty ahead of its time in terms of the super dense sound design heavy projects. And even so, the particular instrumental blend that Culprate explored here does still hold up as unique enough to stand out from the crowd even to this day. The avalanches of people who hold this project up on the 9 or 10 level make perfect sense to me. I totally get it. Now, also like the KOAN Sound project, there were a few moments on this thing where I felt like Culprate was so caught up in making the sound design as mind-blowing as possible, at the expense of making some of the tracks themselves feel like they had as well-defined an identity. Though mind you, this doesn't start to become an issue for me until a few tracks in. The first 4 tracks of this thing were completely nailed and all had their own identity. Like they were properly thought through as songs first and catalysts for crazy sound design second. The opener Whispers Part 1 being the only track with actual vocals and lyrics, and the tune itself is great too, like a blend of psych rock and jazz and IDM. Easily the best track in the bunch and one hell of a way to start the project. Even that singer's tone of voice sorta reminds me of La Sapatique on Hudson Lee's Headspaces. Can definitely retrospectively see the influence there. I also love the glitchy kalimba breakdowns of Florn, which still felt very warm and comforting. The combo of smooth jazz and John Hopkins' Immunity on the Memoirs of Gregory Otterman. Weird mix, but it totally worked. And the kind of vaguely Latin-sounding grooves of Acid Rain slowly evolving to turn into like early Square Pusher-style drum and bass with acid synths and everything. I saw that track come on and I thought, okay, if a track called Acid Rain doesn't have acid synths in it, then you've officially missed a track. And when they came in, I was like, yeah! Now, as incredible as these first 4 tracks were, the rest of the album started to feel more like it was trying to impress you first, and making more memorable individual tracks became less of a focus. In the end, started out compelling with its old-timey pianos working into a creepy psychedelic tune that worked really well, but then about 3 minutes in, it sounded like the track was closing up and winding down, and there was a random switch up into all this tribal percussion and crazy drumming that, while really cool, didn't feel like it had anything to do with what came before and came completely out of left field. Also, the track ends in a super abrupt cutoff into the kind of plinky and sparse drum machines of Void, which, while kinda cool, didn't wow me even close to as much as the stuff that came before it. And well, thankfully, that track is the lowest point of the album, and the project progressively rises back up in quality to where we were before. We never 100% recover the level of those first couple of moments. The last two tracks, Whispers Part 2 and Relucent, come very close, with their complex jazz rock, IDM, etc. meanderings, which are plenty engaging and attention-grabbing, with all the various instrumentation sounding great and working together well, yet never feeling overbearing. They just don't feel as well-structured and punchy as that first handful of moments. And the closer ending with a fade-out was kinda anticlimax as well. Still great tracks, though. But other tracks like Within and Without can sometimes feel like a bit of flashiness and impressiveness for their own sake, combining very Spangle-like world music grooves with modern dubstep breakdowns. Still a lot of fun, but by this point the tracks were starting to run together for me and getting harder to tell apart. The longest track, Yin, running on for 8.5 minutes, did have marginally more of an identity and structure, even if a lot of it was rehashing sounds we've already heard elsewhere on the album. These sounds did feel more like they were going somewhere and had more of a direction in their complexity. But of course this track is made most easily recognizable by its interpolation of Pink Floyd's Welcome to the Machine. Totally caught me off guard hearing those ascending guitar patterns, but it was a welcome surprise. Not better than the original, obviously, but Culprate did his own thing with it. And yeah, that's everything in Deliverance. While I do obviously have my issues all around, for the most part this project did in fact live up to the hype. I definitely get how so many people found this project to be so mind-blowing and life-changing and all the rest of it, especially for the people there to see it when it came out. I bet you had I picked this up in 2014, this would have easily been 9 out of 10 level by now and become an all-time favorite. But unfortunately, given I'm only hearing it for the first time 6 years after the fact, having formed much stronger personal connections to other projects that came out after it that built on similar sounds and styles, this obviously isn't going to be on the same level for me as all those people who have been requesting it for so long. But I'll still hang on to it. I definitely can find a place in my life for an album like this, and it still feels like it sticks out from the crowd to this day. And I've also heard that Culprate had another successful Indiegogo campaign fairly recently to be able to make a sequel to this project, so I'll probably end up checking that out whenever it drops. But yeah, this was a great project and a satisfying way to finish this ridiculously long roundup. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on this. And that's it! That's the end of the roundup. That's it. Oh my gosh. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.